Good morning, everybody. It's 9:30 on the 16th of November in 2020. This inquiry is being held virtually using Microsoft Teams. I'd like to take this opportunity to welcome everyone to today's session. I'm Councillor Peter LeBroy, Chairman of this inquiry process. I'm joined by Councillors Mike McLenning and Jane Pascoe presently, which does make us quorum. However, Jim McKenna and Lee Frost are also sitting on this panel, but not present as of this moment. We're supported today by David Rodder, Economic Growth Manager, who is our Technical Officer, and Lynn Davey, our Democratic and Governance Officer, who has oversight of the process. This session is not being held in public, but a recording will be made available on the Council's website for viewing by the public. The objectives from the inquiry terms of reference are as follows. Number one, to review the current state of the economy in rural and coastal areas in Cornwall and to consider future economic forecasts if current trends continue. For example, sector mix, economic performance, employment, salary levels and population levels. And to consider the necessary and desirable between the rural economy and local towns in Cornwall. Two, to consider what support is already available and planned for rural and coastal areas in Cornwall and investigate alternative methods of stimulating the economy of rural and coastal areas. And by doing that, we're probably going to be looking at taking evidence from other parts of the UK and even the European Union. And item number three, to consider the potential impact of different intervention strategies and to make recommendations on how Cornwall Council can contribute and support the development of the economy in rural and coastal areas in Cornwall. This process consists of a number of recorded evidence gathering sessions, supported by organisational sessions and initial briefing information. This is our sixth, I believe, recorded evidence gathering session. We're taking evidence from witnesses who have particular experience and knowledge to help us. We value the input of all witnesses who give up their valuable time to take part in our process and thank them for their input. With regard to the questioning of our witnesses, the process for each will be the same. Each witness will be briefly asked to introduce themselves or asked briefly to introduce themselves. They then have approximately 10 to 15 minutes for the expert witness to present their views and in Cornwall, and then 3 or 4 recommendations that they feel would help stimulate the economy and vitality of rural and coastal areas. Only inquiry panel members may ask witnesses questions. Other members are very welcome to attend and observe proceedings. I will give them opportunity to comment at the end of each witness session. Although if time becomes limited, this may need to be the end of the evidence gathering session as a whole. Due to the limited time, I'll try to ensure that questions and answers are kept as succinct as possible, particularly as there could be supplementary questions based on responses to other questions. Clarification sought if necessary. All questions and responses are to come through me as the chairman. X in the box, please. But previously on these panels, we've had a fairly informal one-by-one chat with our expert witnesses, which seems to have worked fairly well. So probably not too much need for the X in the box. I'll make sure I do come to all the panel members. Once witnesses have finished giving evidence, they're more than welcome to stay for the remainder of the meeting as an observer. And the evidence from the sessions will be used to support findings and recommendations of the panel. So thank you everyone for listening through the preamble, which we always have to go through. I try to make it slightly different every time, just for my own satisfaction. And good morning, Dick Cole, Councillor Dick Cole.
Good morning, Peter.
We're very grateful for your attendance and very interested in what you've got to hear. We've probably all had the opportunity over the weekend to scan through your document in the making, which looks very interesting. And how this process has run so far, Dick, we've been reasonably informal about it. We've asked, obviously, you or the witnesses to take the opportunity, 10 to 15 minutes approximately. Don't feel you have to take it all to make your presentation. And then one by one, as the panel, I'll invite people to come forward or councillors to come forward and just have essentially a fairly informal chat with you. And I think we feel so far that sort of informal approach has done us quite well. It's allowed us to have quite a lot of freedom in the way the questions have been asked, and it's allowed us to rage fairly widely over quite a number of subjects. So, Dick, no further ado, welcome to you, and the floor is yours.
Good morning. Yeah, it just putting together a few thoughts. I kind of started by, it's very difficult when we're trying to identify different bits of Cornwall as being urban or rural or coastal. There's no one size fits all model. It's pretty complicated, and I think there's such a great deal of variety. For example, if you're talking about something that might be deemed a hinterland to an urban centre or a market town, for example, But then you've got, how do you compare, the very rural Bodmin Moor to the land around Truro? And then when we talk about coastal, which I see has made it into the study, a lot of the coast is actually quite well built up in places and dominated by places like Newquay, Falmouth, Penzance. So I can see it as being a very varied setup, if you like, of what you're trying to address. However, I'd like to specifically talk about clay country, the China clay area, which is, you can call it rural, probably best to call it non-urban maybe. It's a very, very distinctive area. And if I just run through a little bit of background, it's principally 5 parishes. That's St Dennis, St Enedur, St Stephen, Roach and Treverben. We'll acknowledge, however, that obviously part of the clay industry does go further, and the massive Blackpool pit, for example, and associated works does lie actually in St Mewan parish. In terms of our population, we've got 28,000 people, which is larger than most towns in Cornwall, which actually shows it's a place of substance. We're also unique in that we've got an industrial landscape. In places it's post-industrial, but in places, for much of it, it's still a working landscape, still employing a significant amount of people producing clay for various industries. Within it, there's lots of sizable villages. And also we've got the A30 trunk road through the northern part of clay country, which means we've then also got strategic employment sites on that A30. And unlike a lot of what you might term archetypal rural areas, we've got a lot going on. And if you look at the Cornwall local plan, for example, in terms of delivery of employment space, we've actually provided more employment space over the last 9 years than any network area in Cornwall, urban, rural, or a mix of the two. If I just refer you to the target for employment land, that was 13,000 square meters. In the first 9 years of the 20-year plan, we've actually built 20,759. So that's 1.5 times the target. And what has been permitted already in addition to that is 23,500. So as you can see, we're actually, a lot of stuff is happening. Office space, which I know across Cornwall as a whole is coming forward slower than employment space. Our target there is just over 13,000, and we've consented 7,500, and we've got another, we've built 7,500, and we've consented another 5,500 square meters. So I wanted to give the impression, we talk about rural areas where there might be a perception that less happens in those areas than the urban centres, the towns, but that's not necessarily always the case. And that's certainly what's going on in the China clay area. In terms of housing growth, again, we've had a massive levels of housing growth between 1991 and 2010. The China clay area had the highest housing growth of any network area in Cornwall. The figure was 47%. And if you wish to compare that with other areas, Newquay was 32%, St Austell 30%, and then at the other end, Cornwall Gateway 12% and Liscard Loo 14%. And here I'm going to be a bit cynical and sarcastic and say, and obviously having delivered so much housing, which is what people in authority might want, we got a big thank you by having an eco town imposed upon us on top of all the existing housing delivery. And I would just add, if you compare what was delivered between 91 and 2010 and look at what's now within the local plan, by 2030, if the local plan targets are delivered, we will have grown by 87% in 4 decades. Okay, 87% in 4 decades, which again is the highest in Cornwall. So I just wanted to give you that background about, clay country is not a sleepy rural area. It's an area that's had a lot going on, and people are not necessarily happy because it's questionable whether there's been the commensurate investment in the area above and beyond what's been happening in terms of the housing growth and the private sector investment. And there's a lot of fear that a lot of the existing settlements are not getting the support that they want. In terms of looking forward to things like place shaping, we're seen as an adjunct to St Austell. And okay, I'm on the St Austell Bay Economic Forum, but that forum is meant to be looking out for the St Austell, China Clay areas, Par and St Blaise. But the reality of it is the key focus is St Austell. And if I was being sarky, a little bit of the pretty bits on the coast, and they like talking about the Eco Town and Wheel Martin, but then the remainder of Clay Country it doesn't get that much of a look in, to be honest. So there's that, again, disparity between the focus on the town, the urban area, above and beyond the other. So in terms of us not being very happy, the resident survey, on a lot of key questions, we were either the grumpiest or the second grumpiest out of the 19 network areas. And just giving you one figure at random, 12% of residents of Clay Country thought they were able to influence decisions of Cornwall Council. I mean, that's pretty shocking, actually, isn't it? That's the worst figure for any area. And I think it's fair to say they don't consider themselves a priority. And I suppose I could say, is it any wonder if you go back a few years and you've got something really, really unpopular like massive waste incinerator, where are you going to stick it? Shall we stick it up Bude? Shall we stick it down Penzance? Shall we stick it down Liscard? No, let's stick it in Clay Country. You know, it's that kind of feeling that people have. We've got obviously a great deal of deprivation in this area as well. A range of our output areas fall within the 30% poorest. We're looking and trying to get some more statistics to build that evidence even further for the report you've got in front of you. And I would like to be fair and say, yes, there is some investment going in, but to us it seems very, you know, the biggest investment of the last decade was in constructing the incinerator, which was hardly deemed something that was for the community. It was something that was for the whole of Cornwall. And now there is some investment from the council, for example, being focused in on the Eco Town or the so-called Garden Village. And I'd just like to finish by just trying to tell you a little story that Mike can confirm is accurate. We recently were invited to the offices in St Austell. When I say recently, it was pre-lockdown. And two officers came along to tell us about this wonderful new initiative where there was going to be some money for health provision that was going to be made available. They did not expect the reaction they got. They thought that we were going to say that's fantastic. The issue was they came along and told us about that they've got money for health provision for a new settlement that doesn't even exist yet, for people that aren't even there yet. And we just were so annoyed because we represent existing communities with massive social and economic needs. There isn't, at the moment, there isn't a dentist in the whole of the China Clay area, not one dentist for 28,000 people. And yet we're being told this new shiny new settlement, we're going to get this, that and the other, but all the existing settlements are almost like forgotten. So that's kind of a bit of background. Obviously, there is various investment going in various places, but it's not on a level with sort of other areas. And there's the reality that our area is almost invisible to a lot of the decision makers at County Hall because there is an urban focus. You know, how many times have we had these meetings where I'm being the cheeky one continuously saying, and the non-towns areas, you know. So I hope that's a reasonable introduction. The document that I circulated at the end of last week, that's come about because, you know, we've been pushing lobbying authority to say, you're doing place shaping for everywhere else, what about us? We didn't really get very far, and where money has been made available to various towns to do works, that wasn't happening, and we were tied in with the St Austell effort. So in effect, this document was worked on by a couple members of the localism team and then taken forward by the councillors themselves. So this document is really a joint effort of a couple of officers and half a dozen councillors because, you know, we didn't think that we were getting our message through other means. So, and that's my intro for you guys before you want to start grilling me.
Okay, thanks, Nick. My immediate reaction is a huge amount of the things that you're talking about, I think, must be common to probably most of the community area networks. In a strange way, the community area network that I represent and the vice chairman of probably has an awful lot of similarities to yours in terms of we haven't got one single big town. We've got Bude, which is populated, or Bude and Stratton. Bude population of around about 10,000, Stratton a further sort of 2,500, 3,000 on top of that, making a total in the area of 13,000. But that's a relatively small town, and that's the only a place in our patch. I wonder if you've actually just stumbled upon a real driving purpose for all community area networks, and they all should have a strategy document such as this to pull together and properly understand the challenges, which are going to be different across all the community area networks, but to pull together those challenges in a single document that perhaps would encourage Cornwall Council to recognise the individuality of all of the different patches, if you like, in the Cornwall diaspora, if that's not the wrong word to use.
Could I just say I struggle with that a little. I do think the Clay area is different, not least because of its scale in terms of not having an urban centre. Obviously, Bude is a small town compared to St Austell, for example, but it's a small town that then has a rural hinterland in terms of one model, which I think is distinctly different from our area, which in effect, as you look through it, you've got settlements of, for example, if I may bore you, Somercourt, Indian Queens, Fradden, St Cullum Road, St Dennis, Roach, High Street, Trevisco, Nampian, Foxhole, St Stephen, Bugle, Steneleys, Penwithick. You know, it's lots of communities dotted around. And I think it was quite symptomatic when the Unitary Authority was set up and there were 19 networks. Effort was put in to make sure there was a local presence in those networks, and of the 19 networks, I think 17 of them had one or more one-stop shops. For example, the China Clay area was one of those areas that did not have that provision because they just couldn't work out where to stick it, whereas obviously for Bude Stratton you've got that centre. Places like Camborne, Redruth, Hale, St Ives, they actually provided more than one because they went to both urban centres, albeit large or small, whereas we got nothing at all and we were just like too awkward. And the best we could get was a mobile one-stop shop library that lasted 6 months because it was too expensive.
Yeah. Okay, maybe I didn't express myself particularly well there, Dick. I think what I was trying to say was that every community area network has its individual challenges, but some of them are going to make some of them are going to chime. For instance, the dentist story that you told about. Yeah. And I think the point maybe here for me is that each individual community area network will have its own individual challenges, and you have a set of challenges that are very clearly different from every other one, as I do in mine, as Mike does in his, and as well, no, Mike doesn't have in his because he is in yours, and Jane has in hers, and that what you're proposing here, a strategy for the community area network, might be a really good idea for all of the community area network panels. But anyway, look, let's talk about your patch because that's what you're here for, and I respect that absolutely.
Peter, can I say one thing on that? The report that we've done, obviously we were annoyed to a degree that a lot of money was going into other areas and consultants were being paid to bring forward work and all the rest of it. So we were pushing this, and it basically was through the cabinet. They kind of said, you're a pilot, you produce this, and it might be something then that's carried out to the wider, so every network could do its strategy. But that would be in some areas, it would be in addition to all the consultancy work that was being paid for by the council to bring stuff forward. And we changed it a bit in operation so that we kept refusing to call it a pilot exercise, and we also didn't write a strategy. We wrote something that said we want a strategy and identified a lot of the work that we feel needed to be done. So I think there are parallels across Cornwall to understand the areas and see what work needs to be done. but obviously will maintain that our area is very distinctive in terms of the lack of respect it's had from authority, if you like, going back the last 20 years.
Yeah, and I think we would feel your pain equally in my patch. Maybe if it was Bert Biscoe in Truro, he might feel different, but he's not here. Okay. One of the things that did tickle my fancy a little bit was when you said that there wasn't a dentist to be had in your patch. I've had several bits of casework come to me about people asking for access to dentists. We haven't got a public access National Health Service dentist in Bude at all. And the whole argument there strikes me sometimes. We don't even get the basics right. We can do place shaping and investment and wonderful strategies, but actually what people want is some fairly basic stuff like access to dentists. And I know that's not necessarily the council's responsibility, but I think there's an awful lot we can do to make sure we get basic infrastructure in place for people. Let me go to the panel, I think, because otherwise it'll just end up being a conversation between me and you, Dick. Jane, would you like to join in?
Yeah, fine. Actually, you've covered off quite a bit there, Peter, which one or two things I was going to ask. But first of all, Dick, I read your document and I thought it was absolutely great. And I think actually it's great that the councillors had so much input into it, because they're the ones on the ground who understand what happens in these outlying areas. And you bang your drum for your area. South East Cornwall is close behind you. I wish South East Cornwall could say that they'd had employment space. They are working on something in the old cattle market because our industry there's being displaced up to the Devon border. But actually, I don't think it's the answer. It's not that sort of employment space we actually really need there. We're hemorrhaging stuff across the Tamar because we've got no large units for firms to expand into, or indeed for anybody to come down and invest. But moving back to what this inquiry is really about, is part of what it's about, is the interaction between, and if I may call it the hinterland for want of, or the surrounding area, on the towns that service them. So I'm assuming, and correct me if I'm wrong, that all your large villages and area, would you say that their service centre for goods and professional servicing and shopping is St Austell?
No, not completely. No.
Not totally. I was going to say, and if so, what sort of condition, what sort of economic state do you think that the actual town of St Austell or others are in at this present time?
I mean, in terms of the clay area, it's a large area right in the middle of Cornwall. So a lot of the clay area villages, sort of in Penwithwick, Bugle, Steneleys, looping around St Stephen to a degree, they do look towards St Austell. But also, given we're so central, it's not that far to go to other towns. And as at the northernmost part of the clay area, which I represent, so if here I am home in Fradden, I can get to Newquay within 10 miles. You've got Newquay and St Austell, Bodmin, Wadebridge, and Truro is 12 miles. So obviously people in the northern part of the China clay area, a lot of them are quite likely to go get their shopping in Bodmin as they are St Austell. So it's that. So when we have the assumption that the whole of the clay area is tied in with St Austell, it really doesn't understand it at all. You've also then got the added factor that I've made myself very unpopular at Sabbath meetings where they've been talking about the area. And because part of the China clay area is quite a long way away from St Austell, they've produced documentation where my area disappears off the map. It doesn't exist. So you've got the China clay area linked to St Austell, but it doesn't include St Eneder parish. And then you get the comment, your area is not China clay, but the line they've drawn has drawn through the middle of clayworks, and then the 750 acres of clayworks in my parish are on the other side of the line, saying you're not clay area, you just happen to have a big hole. So that's again a very different dynamic, that people do look in lots of different areas. And I think it's fair to say that the high housing growth that's been delivered over the last 20-30 years, it's meant that there are a lot of people who now have moved into this area in order, as it's a central location, which gives them the ability to go to work somewhere else. And quite depressing, I found, when we did the St Enneder parish plan a number of years ago, the top thing about what is great about living in St Enneder parish, and it was its closeness and ability to get somewhere else, which people can say, oh, that's great, you're a strategic location, but actually it was quite depressing for me. The best thing about the village is the speed to go somewhere different. So it's quite varied, to be honest. And again, we're trying to work up the stats more. A lot of our residents live in clay country but work outside because for obvious reasons, and it's like, how can we get more business into the heart of that industry that's above and beyond the clay industry? So there's a lot of factors we're trying to get to grips with.
Yeah, and in that, Chair, if I may, that there's some similarities there with South East Cornwall in that ours, you know, they come to Liskeard to live because it's in close proximity to Plymouth, which of course like a red rag to the bull. But it isn't really. We have to work with Plymouth because that's where the employment is, and similar. And it is so disappointing. And we need, like you, we do need to attract investment into Cornwall, into both these areas, because they could well spin off of each other. Thank you for that. That was interesting.
Thanks, Jane. And Mike, it's your turn to question Dick, although I'm sure you probably know most of this.
Dick's being modest. He's at other meetings, but and Sally Ann have put a lot into this, and I've learnt a lot from this young man since I've been a councillor. I think I agree with everything Dick said, and he speaks his mind, and I probably speak my mind, and I could go even further. We mentioned last Friday at the Traverse presentation, I was the next question to be asked, but Mike Eaton Gibbons always worked to the time. We can't go on, and he closed the meeting. Clay country wasn't mentioned once. Penzance came up again and said, "Oh, we will be looking at doing some investment in Penzance," but there was nothing about the clay country at all. Now, Dick, I can't dispute the figures, but in my division, we haven't got any Cornwall housing. We haven't got any Cornwall housing. I've got to beg, steal and borrow from housing associations, and they're running out of chances on that. And we've got on this week coming on the economy committee, the main council, we've got John Lloyd Owen presenting about home choice. I ask him, this weekend just gone, did he have to get out of bed and go out in the rain and speak to people who are crying their eyes out about home choice? They can't get anywhere to live. Of course he doesn't. He's going to give a theory report. I'm sorry, if I don't get elected next year because I'm too outspoken, I'm going to put him to bits, because I've got people who can't get anywhere to live. And although we've had all this new housing, it's nothing. Social housing doesn't exist, and if it does, there's so many people waiting for it. And I work really hard to support local residents. I've got a connection to St Stephen. We haven't got transport. I mean, system down here in the clay country, which is so important. I know it's not viable to have more than perhaps 1 an hour, but that means some people, I think when I first joined the community, I think they were saying parts of the community, they've got a dental appointment at 11, they've got to try and get a bus at 8 and then don't get home till the 4 o'clock bus or something like that. You can't get out of my village, my own village, to get anywhere unless you drive, and they're all going to say, oh, middle class coon, but they are getting older there, and there's nothing there. If you've been honest and been and sitting that for when we used to go into the chamber, the 3 and a bit years I've been involved, you've never heard the clay country come up. It's the old 80-20 scenario that I'm sick of Penzance. They're getting everything. Penzance. And people said to me, Dulcie Tudor said to me, Mike, oh, you're all right. You've got a housing going up at Carr Clays. Well, 1 week Carr Clays is connected to us. The next week, it's not. You know, even Malcolm Brown's trying to say, oh, you've got some chances. I've got people asking me now, how can they get a property in Carr Clays? They've probably already been allocated. They've already been sorted. So it's all, you know, just cosmetic work. So, you know, I've even wrote to the leader and said to him, do you think the clay countries like the Isle of Dogs on the Thames. It just doesn't. No one answers any questions. You have to beg for everything. And I know I'm going to support Dick to the hilt, but with respect to other councillors, you know, I wish I'd have viewed in my area because it's, you know, quite a nice town. But we have nothing. We've got nothing. We've got a pharmacist trying to open in St Stephen's, but you've got to take into account the culture that I've learnt since I've been down here. It's very difficult to put in change into this area. They're set in their ways over the years of being Cornish, and they don't want a pharmacy. They want to go to their surgery and pick up, and they're used to it, and it's a social little thing for so many people. But again, lots of things are just ignored. I could go on and on and on, but what Dick's put into his report to me is 100%, and we could probably even go more than 100%. We're just a neglected area, and I finished there. Dick knows I support him to the hilt on it.
There weren't tricky questions to Dick, I'm afraid, Mike, but I'm sure you'll want to reflect on what you've said.
I mean, it's quite interesting that we've delivered so much, for example, in terms of housing. So much housing has happened, but then but the level of housing growth has meant that a lot of people have moved into the area. A lot of the people that have moved into the area have moved into the housing type, which tends to be your normal 2-3 bedroomed housing estates. That there are a lot of people are in their 20s and 30s, shall we say. So a lot of those have families, and then we've got this ridiculous situation that the housing growth is massive, but then quite often the home choice registered lists don't seem to go down and we've delivered, I mean, in my division, we've delivered 5 largish exception sites in the last 10 years, and yet we've still got quite a lot of people on the register, and now we're getting aggressive applications from private developers who have failed to do affordable housing, and now they're using the lack of affordable housing provision to justify the next development. It's you feel like you're on a wheel all the time, and yeah, it's sort of getting that service provision joining up the clay area is quite a challenge. The transport networks tend to be through the area, whereas there's a need to be a connectivity across the area, if you like. So you can get a bus and go from Newquay to St Austell or Truro to St Austell, but then if you want to get from one clay village to another, it can be quite awkward because you don't have those links between. So yeah, so there's a lot of really distinct, different issues that we've got to grapple with. And you know, there is at the moment hope that we might actually get a dentist into a surgery at Roach, so something may happen. But I was going to ask Peter, you say you've got no NHS dentists. Do you have other dentists though, imbued, for a matter of interest?
Yeah, we do have private surgeries.
Yeah, but we don't have private. We don't have a single private surgery either. That's what I just wanted to make that clear. We don't have any dentists, full stop, of any provision whatsoever, NHS or others. So, but yeah, so it's an area that needs people getting to grips with, and also it's always like whenever people are looking at the map of Cornwall, we're the area that gets sliced and diced. If I can just give you a couple of examples, when they were doing the last, it was a stalled review of new parliamentary seats, and they had to chop Cornwall up to get to the right number in each of the 6 constituencies they tried it, or the 5.5 they tried at the time. They didn't slice Newquay in half, but they sliced the clay area in half. So you had a third of the clay area going one way, not even respecting a parish boundary, and 2/3 going in a different direction. You've got statistics to look at in the report you've got, which is based on the local action group areas, which I'm not sure is the best way to do it personally, not least because my bit of the China clay area, for some reason, because the output areas are linked, St Eneder is linked to St Morgan and St Cullum going all the way to the north coast, and because that doesn't quite fit the lag areas, my bit of South and East Cornwall has been extracted from South and East Cornwall and stuck into a different lag area. So not even, it seems to happen to us all the time that because there's not, a town does not get sliced and diced, but with us, because we don't have that, it gets moved around. And I'm glad David's put his crossings. I'm about to ask him a question because I'm trying to catch up with Peter Wills, who did that work, and I'll be formally requesting that I get someone to have a little piece of work done, that the statistics he's done wider, I'd like to see if we can generate those same statistics for the China Clay area to back up our report by working off different areas, so the lower super output areas more so than the amalgamated ones that we use. The only positive is we've got no COVID-19 cases in St Enneder at all, because, and that's, sorry, you'll hear the punchline, and that's because our MSOA is 3 parishes, St Cullum, St Morgan and St Enneder, but the title of it is St Morgan, St Cullum. So because they've left us out, everyone thinks we're fine.
Okay, Dick, thanks. I can see that Jane has indicated, and David has also wishes to respond as well, but I've got a list that I want to put to you, and we're obviously running thin on time. So, Jane, you'll go.
Yes, just very quickly, Dick. With your housing growth, and lots of people have moved into the area to take up that accommodation, how are you with the infrastructure with schools? I mean, are your village children having to not be allowed to go to their nearest designated schools? Are you like me, having to have them shoved in taxis and goodness knows what because the schools are full? Or how are you coping?
In my own parish, Summer Court School is increasing its numbers to take more people. Indian Queen's School, it got so desperately bad a few years ago that they had to turn the school into double entry. So Indian Queen's School now has got a capacity of 420 pupils and is up to about 400. So there we did get some classroom improvements. I think our improvements were just after there was a school at Bude Stratton that got done, and I think ours was after the money was cut. So the previous ones had been all singing, all dancing, and ours was a bit on the cheaper side. But at least we got our new classrooms. 6 years on, I'm still trying to get the play space sorted, which is proving quite difficult. That's another story. But at Queen's, it was so desperate they had to increase capacity. There are other horror stories though. Roach, which is the area that's had the highest percentage growth of housing. Actually, it's Camelford was top, Roach was second by parish, and absolutely phenomenal levels. Primary school really struggled. John Wood is pulling his hair out because you've got the position that a lot of the Roach families that live on the farms around the village, 4th, 5th, 6th generation, and now they can't get their kids into the local school that every generation has gone to since the school was built. So it is a real problem in areas, and again, we keep being told it's great, we're going to have a new school in the eco town, and it's like, if I may say, sod the eco town. It's the existing communities where the priorities should be. And again, I'd rather than Cornwall Council now buying some of the homes to make them affordable in the eco town, I'd rather that investment went straight into existing communities. So instead of trying to prop up a massive private sector development, they were actually targeting investment at small affordable housing schemes in the villages that need it, without the open market housing, which just increases the population and adds to pressures.
Yeah, now that's interesting. It's a similar situation. I mean, the trouble is with one of our local schools, Wayne Homes were allowed to build right round it, so they can't even expand, but we're absolutely bursting in the walls. Thank you for that, Dick.
No worries.
All right, thanks, Jane. David, as quick as you can, because we've got, I think, 6 minutes left of Dick.
Thank you, Councillor Labori. David Rodder, Economic Growth Manager at Cornwall Council. Thank you, Councillor Cole, for your comments. Very quickly, absolutely, if you need Peter to do some work to help you with your report, then if the data is available, we can do it for you. So just get in touch with him. I spoke to him this morning, and he's going to give you a call this week or today, because he only picked up your email this morning, I think. So ask him.
Peter rung at 9:24. It was right, the phone call I was having that I had to cut short to come in here. So it's brilliant. Okay,
so he will do whatever you need there. Just to also let you know that you've seen the evidence report that the panel has got. We are doing an extra piece of evidence around to support that around rural deprivation, particularly. because the report itself, the panel identified that at headline level, rural areas, there's a lot of positives, but actually recognising that there's significant deprivation within affluent areas, but also in specific pockets as well. So we are doing a bit more a report to try and pull that out. In the final panel report, there will be some narrative explaining that there's different types of rural and coastal. We criticise government about their city region approach, where the focus tends to be on the cities and the trickle down out to the areas, the commuting areas, and forgetting the areas that are not within commuting distance. So the report will have a section on that, and your report for China Clay area sounds like it will provide me with some of the narrative I might need to do that. So I can assure you that we will be recognising there are different types of rural and coastal in Cornwall. That's it. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. If I could just be really cheeky, and thank you for that. I'll be talking to Peter later this afternoon, and I was just hoping that in whatever we do, when we're looking at component blocks of Cornwall that are deemed rural for the studies, that we do get evidence for them specifically. So I'm keen that whatever work is done, that we get data out of it for what we term the China Clay area. That would be really helpful to my work as well as yours as a whole. Thank you.
Just ask Peter for what you need, Councillor Cole, and we'll sort it out.
Brilliant.
Thanks, Dave. Thanks, Dick. We'll go to Mike, and Mike, we make it as quick as we can because I want to try and squeeze Dick's recommendations.
Just two things. One, I went to the very first meeting of Car Clays, and I was new to it all then. And I asked the developer the question, and he said he's going to have a school, doctors and dentists, and that was, I don't know how many years back, Dick, that meeting was held. So I said, well, I can remember one of our councillors, John Wood, who was new. I was new to him. He said he's trying to get a dentist then. So I said, we're trying to do one. How do you do it? He said, oh, I can show you. I know how to do these things, like that, like someone from my own town of London. But that was one thing. Secondly, I've got people who can't even get to Fradden to go to the new estate there, like Marks and Spencer's and Boots, unless they've got a car. And I've tried everything. So I could go on, but I just want to add those 2 points. Right.
Okay. Thanks, Mike. Okay. So I got a whole long list. Dick, I'm not sure how much I want you to respond on any of these. All right. Dick, we had a guy called Jeremy Rathall, who's the MD of a company called Cornish Lithium, present to us earlier in the week. Early in the process, and he was talking about the principle of using effectively quite a lot of the exhausted clay pits for lithium extraction. Just wondered if you're aware of that, because that would have probably quite a significant impact on what's going on. Maybe you'd also like to comment. I've been a big fan on the principles of trying to put something which isn't a fancy word to it, but non-linear public transport systems. That is things like buses that don't just go from A to B, but public access to public transport that is more of an on-demand type basis. Yeah. I'm a big fan of it, and I'm a bit annoyed actually that I hadn't thought about this before, because this, I think, needs to form a bit more of this inquiry. But never mind. I just want you to maybe comment on that very quickly. When you're talking about Penzance getting all the investment, I mean, I've asked him. I thought, well, I'd like investment to come to Butte because we don't seem to get anything up here either. So I got in touch with Tim Dwelly, well, probably about a year or so ago, and said, what makes Penzance get all the money when we don't? And he told me that effectively it's years and years of ongoing work and collaboration on the ground between councillors and other interesting parties, bringing ideas and projects forward and requesting investment into their areas. And it's not something which happens overnight. It's something which an awful lot of work has gone towards. So I've attempted to start that process in Bude, and I think obviously it sounds like, Dick, you're very much indeed on your way on this process, so perhaps you'd like to just comment on that. Investment doesn't just land on your doormat without you asking for it. You've got to actually encourage it. So anyway, Dick, if you'd like to make a comment, if you like, you don't actually have to on any of those points, and then in the same lot, can we squeeze some recommendations out of you?
Okay. First and foremost, on the issue about transport, I totally agree, non-linear. And if you see our asks, we're talking about on-demand, community-based transport. Provide better link across the spot on. In terms of the what you've said about what's happening in the various towns, I think sometimes those towns have partnerships with large business links, that so you've got the private and the public together, which gets momentum. And I think from my experience, sometimes who asks the question, it varies who gets the answer. So I can assure you that those of us in the China Clay area have been asking and asking and asking and not really getting very far. And then we've been getting really annoyed when sort of some private sector people go in to talk to senior officers, and suddenly money is made available for forums and stuff. So it's sometimes you do pester and not seem to get anywhere if it doesn't fit the model. And you know, that's certainly been my experience, that the linkages between private sector asks does seem to generate more money, not necessarily investment in specific things, but at least to get like place shaping initiatives off the ground. I mean, I think my one request would be, and this is something I asked in the council over 10 years ago, I actually asked it in the first administration, that somebody actually does an audit of where Cornwall Council puts its money in terms of investment, and just to see the geographic spread. I think that would be the one thing that would be so helpful, because we've all fallen in the trap. We've gone public and said something about we don't get this, they get more, but then when you drill down to the figures, you find that your assumptions are not accurate. So I'm happy to say that I'm happy to be challenged that the clay area may get more than I think it does, and certain areas that I think get loads get less. But I'd like to see a piece of work done to actually give us the evidence proper, and I think that would be the one recommendation I'd give you guys.
Okay, so
on top of make a China clay priority for the next years.
Okay, so let's just make sure we go through this properly. So recommendations wise, what do you think this, in terms of if you want this panel to come up with very specific recommendations to the committee and therefore to go on to cabinet, do you want to list them out?
Well, I mean, I think I think there should be an audit of where council expenditure goes on a geographical basis, and I think that's something, you know, how have we spent our money, where have we invested over the last 10 years, link that into the European programs and other stuff. Obviously, European programs sometimes have obviously been very focused, like the lag in, like the CLLD lag in particular, focusing on the poorest areas, which means that includes the clay area because of its levels of poverty. But the overall picture of where the council is putting its money, I think, is a key thing. And I think trying to, I'm not sure how to put this, but there needs to be a greater understanding within the authority between non-town areas, so that it's not automatically people are thinking towns first and then everything else. It needs to be, and I'm not sure how you're going to do that, but I think that should be one of your priorities, is to try and work on the assumption that all the areas of Cornwall are treated on a par, albeit with their different dynamics.
Okay, I'm tempted, Dick, to want to say something along the lines of the document that you've produced or are producing in terms of this, the one that you've shown us. I think actually it's probably quite a big thing, and that goes hand in glove with what you said in your first action point, as that this audit of economic investment by area, that we actually say that perhaps every community area network needs to create some sort of document in order to attempt to create a level playing field for investment opportunities through the council.
Yeah, that's a fair comment.
Right. Okay.
Yeah. It's just, I mean, obviously this has been done totally in isolation well, not in isolation, we've pulled it together, and obviously if it's being done across the whole of the area, obviously we need to make the linkages to make sure that they're doing that. I'm going to sound like Boris Johnson, levelling it round, you know. So
Dick Cole, the new Boris Johnson. Well done. Thank you for that.
So.
Okay, so
Very
Dick,
good.
thank you very much for that. Mike, you're desperate to come in, aren't you? So we'll let you just have a very quick go, Mike, but then we do need to move on to Rob Paul of CRCC.
You actually asked me my questions. I just I answered just now. No, I don't know if my hand stood up or something, but no, I'm fine with Dick. I mean, it's a good piece of work, and I know you're right to say the others should be looking at doing a similar sort of thing, but you know, I'm shouting hard for the Clay country area, and it's, you know, if the others people, they've got to sort themselves out unless they're happy with what they get. I would leave you with the fight we have to get money for highways. You know, it's like begging on our knees for it. You could say it's the same everywhere else, but again, we don't seem to be too popular with that. And Dick knows how we better push like mad to get even just some lights up to say you're speeding or whatever. Hell of a problem, but we just get answered by the officers, which is, I get tremendous support, but it's money, isn't it? But you can soon see Truro get it, St Austell gets it, but we don't get it.
Yeah. Okay, Mike, thanks. Right, so Dick, I'm going to give you my thanks. Thanks from the chair and thanks from the panel. Thank you for presenting to us. It's been very interesting to see the principle that you're applying to your community area network, and obviously to understand the challenges that you guys have got in front of you. And I think the particular challenges that you've got are a much greater magnification of the rural challenges than probably almost every other community area network, on the basis that you haven't got that urban population at all in the network. So thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Peter. I was hoping to hang around and listen, but the guys mending my house have just arrived. I can hear them banging on the wall at the back, and I'm also double booked with other things, but I hope to dip into some of your other sessions if I can squeeze it. So, but thank you.
Well, you're very welcome. You're very welcome. Thank you.
Bye.
Right. So on now to Rob. And first, Rob, I'll give you my apologies. We're running. Let's have a look. 7 minutes late. So sorry to keep you waiting. Welcome to the meeting. At the beginning of the meeting, I read out a long preamble. I'm not going to do it now again because the other councillors will probably lose the will to carry on. But welcome to the meeting. This is obviously an inquiry into the economic vitality of rural and coastal areas in Cornwall, and hopefully you'll have been given an information pack up front. So if I'd invite you to come onto video and open up your microphone. The idea is we got sort of 10 to 15 minutes. Don't feel you have to use all of it, just to lay out your position with rural vitality. And then we'll have an informal chat to and fro between councillors, and hopefully finish up with you by 11:15-ish. So, Rob,
okay,
welcome.
Great, thank you for that. I mean, I'm here this morning for Catherine Nissen. Catherine's our chief executive. They've just had a delivery arrive at home of food, so kids everywhere. I'm here for Catherine. We're an economic, we're a charity that deals with delivery. Our main areas of work are carers, where we run a big carer support service, working with about 16,000 carers across Cornwall. IT outreach for those who struggle with IT and who struggle to access IT. We run a telephone service there. A lot of work around mental health and dealing with people who come to us with mental health issues. We run a youth work project, and we work with the council with youth work for young people who've been excluded below the ages of 16 in Newquay and places. And we do quite a lot with debt provision, especially with those with complex debt needs. And we deliver a number of contracts there for the council around very hard to reach people with very complex debt problems. And I run a little group of five of us who deal with coastal communities and fishing. And we run a project based on a report we did called Fishing for a Future, which is about supporting the inshore fleet, which in Cornwall's case is about 700 individuals around the coast. So I looked at your briefing, and it's quite a big briefing you want to look at. We see challenges, we see growth challenges and opportunities in tourism, land-based industries, and second homes. I mean, we've got to accept these things are here and with us, and maybe we need to make more from them. An awful lot of second home owners we come across say they would like to contribute more, but don't know how to do that. So there might well be opportunities there. But if we look at land-based industries, looking at the youth work that's gone on recently, This is looking mainly in Yorkshire and the Midlands around youth, but it's just the same in Cornwall. 97% of young people from a rural background want to stay in a rural community and live there. 65% feel there's not enough housing. 85% now think that COVID will have an impact on their future. More than 2/3 of young people want to start a business in the rural area. And of those who are on farms, 80% think their future is not going to be on the farm, but in diversifying into something else. And the biggest barriers are labour, enterprise startup capital, and dealing with technology or access to technology. If I look a bit wider with our rural work, the biggest challenge we see is access to services. And that's getting harder, and it's harder for people to reach what they want to reach. Other things that were there a while ago and seem to have gone, things like Wheels to Work and youth clubs in communities, have become much harder to access and find. And when we look overall Cornwall, 88% of micro businesses, now that's less than the national figure, I think, or fairly similar. The average profit's £8,000. There's an awful lot of people out there, self-employed, running their own business, who are making very little money. And of those from the national figures, 25% broke even. So there's a lot of micro business which is just treading water and faces many challenges. Put down here, there's no easy solutions here. Cornwall has a growing debt problem. And we see that in our work, and we see that growing really significantly. And this was before COVID, so it's only getting worse. Our carers service have asked us to try and come up with a new plan for how we deal with growing debt in the caring community. That's new. We think there's opportunities to develop and support credit unions. In other bits of the country, credit unions work really well. It's not working in Cornwall, and there are clear reasons why, but they can be resolved. We've been doing some work with John Moores University, and we've just formed a national credit union for the fishing community across the country. That's happening. We should build more resilience into a Cornish credit union, and maybe do some hard evaluation of the current micro business support, and maybe some social return on that investment. What real difference is all the millions that have gone into business support? What is it? And it's about linking town and countryside better. Maybe the return to more traditional marketplaces, to bringing that countryside into the towns. And I know the challenges that faces, but linking up rural transport and bringing the two together. That's just a quick ramble through of this. We see.
Rob, sorry, I think your connection went on at the end, and I'm not sure.
Yeah, turn that off.
Right. So, are we all still here? Yeah,
I'm
okay.
here.
Yes, still here.
Mike, I hear you. Jane, I'm assuming you're still here. David looks like you're still here. So I think that the connection issue, Rob, is probably yours. If that's okay.
Yeah, that's fine. No, I live out in the middle of nowhere.
Okay. Yeah. You're probably a good candidate of evening up the playing field on access to good quality internet services. Right. Okay. Rob, really interesting. Did I get this right? Did you say that you are in contact or somehow responsible for 16,000 carers?
Yeah, we run the carers support service for Cornwall Council. That is 22 care support workers who then work with many carers, doing their carer referrals, offering them the small grant service that we deliver on behalf of the council and being in touch with them and giving them someone to talk to about their role as carers and about the complexities of caring. And they've really asked me as the member of staff who deals with our debt work to say what sort of support can we offer with access to debt work, because the current suppliers of debt are pretty well at their limit with the support they can offer.
Right. Okay. This whole problem of debt is one of the things I think is absolutely horrible. That once people get into it, that sort of descending spiral of having borrowed money that they then can't afford to pay back is horrendous, and that more than anything is probably. I mean, I don't know the reasons why people end up in awful poverty, but I suspect that having taken on more debt than they can comfortably handle is possibly a problem, and I just worry sometimes that access to debt is too easy, and we should be providing financial support to families that are struggling to provide for themselves before they actually get themselves into that situation. I don't know if you want to comment on that.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay. Another thing that you said that has struck me, and I've thought about this a bit, and I haven't come up to any sensible answer on it. Sorry, Rob, are you there?
Yes, I'm here. Sorry, I missed.
Lynn, I'm not sure how to handle this because we're losing Rob and I keep talking over him by mistake.
Peter, it might help if Mike turned his camera off as well. I sometimes find that with the bandwidth. Might help, might not.
Sorry.
If I turn mine off, does that help? Rob, let's try again because we missed most of what you just said.
I think we've got two families that we see where debt has become overwhelming, where they become a carer, so they lose the ability to earn whatever income they were in before, and where we have a single parent with children. Those both find initial access to finance very easy through groups like Ocean Finance and others. Then once they're in debt and they've borrowed that first £1,500, then they find it very, very hard to pay back. So if you borrow £1,500, your minimum repayment is only £25 a month, but they can never then get out of that cycle and the debts just grow and become more complicated. And then once they miss a council tax payment, they don't fully understand the difference between priority debts and non-priority debts. And that's where we then get into problems.
I think more education on debt and acquiring debt is probably really important, because the people that acquire debt obviously will acquire it to get themselves out of a hole, and it might be much better for them to seek other forms of help and support before they did it, because as you say, once you start, it's a spiral that's very, very difficult to get off. Right, okay, let's have a go. Mike McLenning, would you like to have a chat with Rob first?
That's more, I think.
I'll keep my screen off because it may help, Rob. Can you hear me?
Yeah, fine.
I've got a few questions actually, and I missed part of it and it went funny. You said early on, harder to reach. What did you actually mean by it? I do the questions individually. Harder to reach. What do you mean by that, Rob?
So we work, if you've got yourself into complex debt, then you're normally engaged with other parts of the authority, with social services, child support, whatever it is. So we then offer a service for those people who don't want to engage and have got very complex needs around housing, around complex mental health, abuse. So we have a support worker who is trained as a debt support worker to the same standards as you'd get from Citizens Advice, but works on a one-to-one basis with you. High intensity stuff for our hardest to reach cases.
Okay, I'm a non-exec of Cornwall Housing, and obviously get involved in lots of difficult cases, but that if the people are on Cornwall Housing, there's an excellent team there who deal with situations like this. So that's just, you want to make a note of that unless you know it.
Yes, yeah, no, we do, and this work is particularly focused on those who've sort of slipped through the gaps and are in private housing or emergency housing.
Okay. Youth clubs. I started one in Foxhole in January this year, but of course since COVID, haven't been able to open, and it's been very successful. You mentioned volunteers. We're finding it now in the villages that the generation coming up behind me plus one probably, their thoughts are not necessarily linked about having village etc. involved in helping that sort of thing. I'm going to be quite harsh now. £8,000 is some of these people are earning on micro businesses. Well, they wouldn't be doing micro businesses and keep going if they're only making £8,000. I know you can't, well, I've been self-employed, and it's all about making sure you put all your expenses in, etc., etc. I've had some terrible, huge tax bills, and because I've been stupid in the past, not self-employed anymore. But some of these people don't always tell the truth on what they're earning, and that's me being harsh in private in this meeting. Rising debt problems. I go around and see lots of people. I've had debt problems of my life 30 years ago. Ended up in the law courts having to do a deal with the HMRC. There is an organisation which is brilliant called Step Change, who give you peace of mind. I learnt then that I was doing outside my means. What the chairman was trying to say. I've been told off making comments back to Cornwall Council saying I've been someone they can't afford their rent, but they're smoking. I had to cut the knife to get through because they're smoking, and someone said to me at the council, well, you can't tell people what to do. But then I was going there to try and help. So every problem does have an answer, and I'm being strict here. Many of them are caused by themselves, and mine was caused by myself. The credit unions I don't know enough about, so I'm thinking that there are organisations, and as the chairman said, some of these people do need to help themselves, and it's quite easy to get credit, or it was. And I think some of the things, I'm not being political here, but I think we've got our own hardship fund in my division for people, but only 5 people have come on to me for that. I don't believe it's because they're embarrassed, because I know there are enough, so many people on division, they would come on and ask for it. Everybody thanked the universal credit going up by £20 a week. So I think there's a lot of help going on out there. And perhaps your organisation isn't big enough, I haven't got the staff to deal with these sort of things, but perhaps we're tackling it wrong from adult social care, and even I dare say Cornwall Housing with their advisors, because it's there. So that's all I wanted to say, really. You can respond if you like to me.
I think you're right on some of that. I think the John Moores University report on the black economy said 30% of the Cornish economy is black. So there's a lot going on. On debt and access to debt advice, once you've made that first step, then yes, there is help and support out there. We've just been involved in a report that's just been published called Fishing Without a Safety Net. And that just shows the level of problems in the fishing community. It doesn't offer too many solutions, but what has come out of that is the idea of a credit union, which in Ireland works really, really well, and in Cornwall doesn't. So there are solutions, there is help, but it is a significant problem in Cornwall. I just raise it, we've got 27% of children, living in poverty. We're involved where we're involved, but there is a need to do more, and obviously access to finances is the barrier. We have one debt worker.
Yeah, all I would say back is poverty, with the help that's going on out there, then the trouble's got to start at home for that child to go without, somewhere along the lines, in my opinion. I know it sounds outrageous, so I'm not sort of being kind, but I am being kind in the right places, and I help everyone I can in the right places. But we've got to look at if the kids can't afford to have someone's got to pay for their school lunches when they go to term time, and the parents drinking, smoking till the cows come home, then that's where the problem starts. And perhaps we're not addressing, and it could be too late now, we're not addressing the real problem. We're trying to help where the problem's got to, which is important as well. Thank you.
Yeah, okay, right. So Jane Pascoe, would you like to come in, please?
Yeah, I'll leave my camera off as well. I think it does help your bandwidth. I experience similar problems, but hello. That was really interesting. I just wanted to touch on something with you, which I experience in my rural villages in my division. And I'm one of these councillors that actually gets out on the ground a lot and talk to people and deliver things and really try and get a good handle on who's struggling in the community, who needs help. And what I have got is single people living generally in affordables or later living, but they're mainly gentlemen who are very lonely. They feel disconnected. They're in a lot of them, well, some of them in depression, despair, and even some that, you know, threaten suicide. And they sort of shut the world out, and they often go under the radar of, I don't know, social services and people. And I wonder if that's the sort of support your carers do, who support the carers, because these are people who don't have a carer. They have no need, physical need, for somebody to go in on a daily basis. But they sort of got so used to shutting themselves away. I mean, even in every case, and I do have several, the curtains are always pulled. It's as if they've shut the world out. And I often think if there were activities in a village, like, I don't know, I was trying to sort of think about a carpentry shop or a workshop, a repair shop, where it's a place they could get together with other fellow folks that they could converse with, whether that would help. And I wondered what you thought of that. The other thing is, I'm not terribly conversant with your group, but where do you get your funding? In Liscard, we have a very busy food bank. And I remember a couple of years ago, we're always fundraising for it. And I did say to the person who runs it, have you contacted the mobile phone companies and the big ones and asked them to help? Because most of the people that fall into debt or hardship have these mobile phones, and I'm not saying they shouldn't. They're absolutely right. It probably is their only connection they've got, because they probably won't have landlines. But the mobile phone companies take a lot of money off of them in these contracts, and they make a lot of money. And I just wondered if they actually do pay back into the community, or if that's a route you might investigate.
Yes, a lot there. I'm not really sure on mobile phone. We get a lot from the energy companies. As a charity, our income is about just over £2 million, and we have 85 staff. So we're quite proactive as a charity. Isolation and loneliness is a huge, huge unmet problem. And we are just working on a project taking the Danish model of taking village halls and making them far more pluriactive in what they offer and what they deliver. So we're just starting some work on that on 4 village halls in the far south west. But no, big problems, no easy solutions.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Rob. Jane, you might want to have a look at menssheds.org.uk. It's a movement to get like people exactly in that bracket that you're talking about together in community set environments. But I'm really
Thank you.
interested in what Rob's saying about village halls, because realistically, if you did get a men's shed movement going in your community, in reality, it probably would only be providing what a village hall may have done sort of 30, 40, 50 years ago. And that is a place where people can get together and actually be in each other's company, and enjoy that sort of interaction that you would have on that sort of level. And I think that's a much wider societal issue that sort of we seem to have acquired in the last 10, 20 years or so. But anyway, Rob, I've got a question for you. I can't remember the percentage, but it was really high. It was something like 80% of young people that would aspire to own their own business. And I was just interested. I wonder if that aspiration is only there because there's no hope of employment in rural communities as you would have, say, if you lived in a city somewhere, because you probably would have any number of potential employers. But if they just aren't there, actually making your own business and ploughing your own furrow is often the only aspiration and vision that young people can see.
Yeah, I think you're right there. I think it's what they see as the way to stay where they are, and certainly often on the farm there is land and buildings available, and there are many rural buildings available. So that's what people look to do is to self-start. Yes, I think you're right. I've not done the research on it, and I don't know what the position is, but that's a national position which I feel Cornwall would reflect.
Yeah, okay. But the interesting thing there is that in these days of, I'm up in Bude, Mike is in Clay Country, Jane is down on the south coast. Lynn, I'm not exactly sure where you are, but I think you're not too far away from Jane, are you? We're all dotted all over the duchy. So the reality is that as time goes on, if people have got access to decent internet connections, they should be able to access other work opportunities that aren't necessarily self-employment wherever they are in the world. Would you feel that's an opportunity coming forward, do you think, or is it something?
It is. I think it's real. It's inspirational. I think these are things where Cornwall could really lead the way by investing in those areas. Yes, it open.
Question for you, Rob. Most people in Cornwall seem to be quite anxious about second home ownership and communities being negatively affected by houses that are empty for a large portion of the year. But conversely, you said you felt it might be an opportunity. I wonder if you just expand your thoughts a little bit for us on that, please.
Well, we have a lot of second homes, and that's not going to change at a big political level. It's not going to change. And although changes have happened in Cornwall, we're not going to stop it. So we need to embrace it. Now, speaking with second home owners, quite a few want to make a difference. So in one community where I've got a worker, they're sending out, or they've sent out an invite to all the second homeowners to say, let's have a community lunch. You come along, share with us your background, your experience, your skills, and see what you can do to help our community. That I think is quite a positive way to deal with it. And obviously it's been delayed with COVID, but I think that's a great way to actually get communities and second homeowners talking together, because they want to get as much out of Cornwall as they can.
Yeah, agree. The other thing that you touched upon was access to services and work, and you mentioned the service or the organisation Wheels to Work. Is that no longer operating in Cornwall?
No, I don't. It might well be. To be honest, David might know better. I've not looked, but one thing that does come up is access to transport, and moving from town to village is a very, very hard to solve problem.
Right, okay, so I can immediately see David's put an X in his box, so perhaps, David, you might have an answer for us.
Yes, thank you, Councillor DeBoy. The last conversation I had with the Wheels to Work programme was that funding is challenging for them. The model is really challenging. The demand is there, but funding it is is difficult. There's also the issue about now whether that will change with the advent of electric bikes, perhaps, rather than mopeds. But then not everybody wants to be cycling or on a moped when the weather is inclement as it can be. So I think funding, as with a lot of things, is the key issue with that scheme.
Okay, thanks. Right, okay, does any of the panel have any further questions for Rob, please? Oh, right, I'll tell that as a no. So Rob, what we're asking our witnesses to do is to suggest 1, 2, 3, 4, perhaps, if you like, interventions or actions that you think Cornwall Council could consider to help rural and sort of coastal areas, those areas that are not towns, to bring forward. Did you have any ideas at all for us?
There's only two, I think, where Cornwall Council could make a real difference. One is to take seriously the role of credit unions, not what we currently have, but what it could be. So run a Zoom conference, run a masterclass with one of the big universities that's got real expertise in credit unions, like John Moores in Liverpool, where they really know what they're doing, and some of the Irish credit union members and groups, and really thrash out what could credit unions be and what difference could they make to our communities. Because for people on the edge of poverty, it is a real help. And we found that with our small work with our fishing community credit union work. So that's one thing. And the other thing is, do take serious return on investment, not only when you've done a project, but before you start a project. There are great tools out there to help you with social returns on investment. So use them more, take them on board, and really get to understand it. Those are my two.
Okay, we haven't really done this properly, actually, talking about, or for me thinking about it, and you've extolled the virtues of credit unions, but could you talk on that a little bit to me? Tell me, or tell us, the panel, if it's okay, a little bit more about the precise benefits and how credit unions work and benefit the people in those demographics you're talking to.
Credit unions work. When you look at the evidence, when people get into credit problems, there's a tipping point. Something happens. They need £300 or £400 for something and they don't have it. So they use inappropriate credit. So a credit union works that you pay in every week or every month, and that builds up. And then you can borrow without credit checks or any real messing around up to 3 times what you've saved and pay that back over a reasonable time period. So it's a way for people on low incomes to borrow and save in a supported way. The other thing is you can open a bank account with a credit union. So when people first get into a mess, what happens is the bank starts charging them 20 quid for every bounced direct debit or whatever. So by opening an account with a credit union, you can stop that loss to the banking community and you can start to give yourself some independence. And then it goes on to arrangements. You can actually save and structure your income and outgoing. So it works really, really well. And where people have engaged with it, it's really turned them around. So it's really a positive tool for microfinancing.
Okay, that's really interesting and really helpful. I think that's something which actually could be a really good intervention for us to consider, because that level of support to the rural community and people that do find themselves in those positions of taking on unexpected debt. It's when the car fails its MOT by a massive amount, or the washing machine fails, or some critical part of your family infrastructure suddenly requires a bit of money pumping into it that hasn't been planned for. I think that's exactly as you said, when people do find problems, isn't it?
Yeah, and the other beauty of it is I've trained 3 of our staff now to be able to be credit union agents. So often the credit union is run by volunteers, or the actual intervention points of volunteers. So each community can have its own local intervention point where you can go and pay your money in, get money out, get some help locally, and start to build that network of self-resilience.
Okay, lovely. Okay, so Rob, thank you very much indeed. We've now well, I was going to say I'll do the thanks properly. So we're very grateful to you for attending the session. Very grateful for the evidence you brought forward, and you've given us some really good interventions which we can put forward into our findings. So grateful for that, and thank you.
Cheers. Bye bye.
Okay. Cheers. So back to the panel. We're now running a little bit earlier than the schedule. We did have an hour put by for Rob, but we've used up almost exactly the same 45 minutes that we would normally use. But I can see that Kim Spencer's in the room. Should we go with Kim now, and then maybe have a break before 12 o'clock? Have a 15-minute break. I think that would work quite well for me.
Sounds
if that's
like a
okay.
plan.
Yeah, right. Okay. So the plan is, Kim, if you're happy, we'll run a little bit early with you.
Yeah.
But we'll put a cut off of 11:45 and we'll have a 15-minute break before our next witness. So Kim, I'm not going to read. There's a lengthy preamble that I open up this meeting with, which I'm not going to go through because you've had the pack. But effectively, this is an inquiry panel looking at the economic vitality of rural and coastal areas in Cornwall. That is everything that's not effectively an urban or town type environment. I'm sure you know exactly why we're here.
I've been at the meeting right from the start, so I've been listening into all the other commentators.
Right, lovely. Okay, thank you very much indeed.
And you can put your cameras back on if you want, because we do have super fast here. So
right, okay. I'm back with you, so thanks for that.
I'm back to first seeing faces. I get a bit daunted by just a screen and initials.
I know it does feel a bit lonely rather than no faces at all on the screen, doesn't it? I'm with you. I'm with you. So very first, welcome and thank you very much for attending our panel. It's very kind of you to give your time. We know how valuable time is to people. You've seen how it operates, so 10-15 minutes, don't feel you have to use it all, just to lay out your position on how you feel the current sort of economic vitality of our non-town areas is, and then we'll go back to the panel and just have a bit of informal interaction with you, and then we'll end up by trying to get some positive intervention strategies out from you. All right, so Kim, the floor's yours. Thank you.
Thanks, Peter. So I'll start off by saying that I've written mine out as notes, which I'm going to read out, and that's because, as Jane, who's known me for some time, knows, I have a tendency to ramble, and I do feel I've got a lot to say. So I'm trying to condense it down into notes. So I do apologise that it makes it a rather stilted style and it's not quite as easy as the others, but there you are. It will keep me to time. So hello everybody, my name is Kim Spencer, and for context I want to set out my involvement in the rural economy in Cornwall. I've owned a tourism business in Loo for the past 17 years, employing a number of full, part-time and seasonal staff. I've chaired the South and East Cornwall Local Action Group and vice-chaired the Fisheries Local Action Group, and I'm currently the chair of the South and East Cornwall CLLD. I represent the Greater South West at the Rural DEFRA groups, which are countrywide, and I represented this Rural DEFRA group and England as a whole pre-Brexit on the European Rural Group. I'm a trustee of Loo Development Trust, the vice chair of Sector South East Cornwall Tourism Association, and more importantly, I'm a mother of 3 children aged 18 to 22. I do not have the kind of access to the kind of data that others have presented, but my experiences in community-led local development, which has successfully supported businesses and people in Cornwall for many years. The rural economy is interdependent on every sector in it. Tourism relies on the country's stewardship to provide great landscapes, on small food producers to provide distinctive local food, and on the fishing industry to continue the ports and harbours, which are a huge draw to visitors. One cannot be successful without the others, and this network of interdependency is becoming ever more fragile by the day. The COVID pandemic has brought into sharp focus how much we depend on visitors. When tourism accommodation was closed, all other businesses struggled even when they were able to open. Speaking to traders in Loo, they barely sold enough to warrant staying open, and many either reduced their trading hours or closed, waiting for the accommodation to open once again. It's therefore important when looking at supporting businesses, we realise for supporting one small part of a sector, the multiplier effect of that support will sustain many other businesses. Tourism is vital to our coastal areas. The often quoted phrase this summer was that we have too many tourists. I actually strongly dispute that. I do not think that Cornwall has too many visitors. I think it has too many visitors in too few places where other places could easily accommodate them, and we do not spread them out across the whole year. In short, we don't have too many visitors, just not in the right places and or at the right time of year. The new cycle trail in Loo would draw visitors to Loo and Liscard away from Padstow, and that is a key example of that. And why is this? I believe it's because investment in larger infrastructure projects and businesses directly and indirectly is concentrated in what I would call the same old areas. Those areas are able to bid for the funds because they have the capacity and the human infrastructure in place to facilitate those winning bids. We are constantly pouring money into the same areas, and then we wonder why these areas are overloaded, when it's naturally because that is where the most is going on. To address the balance, we have to disproportionately support those areas that don't naturally have the human and physical infrastructures. If you look at the historic maps of where support funding has gone across Cornwall, we see that the southeast of Cornwall and the far north have not had their fair share of this, and this is why we have a lopsided economy. The LEP recognise this in their latest call and have asked for more projects from these areas. Concentration of resources in specific geographical areas leads to more properties being purchased as tourism accommodation, often from those out of county, driving the price up and beyond local people. Many coastal areas are now beyond saturation point, and the lack of full-time residents diminishes the number of people who support and run projects for locals, who bring businesses together into cooperatives, etc. South and East Cornwall is home to a rich mix of small businesses, often single person, in creative industries, value-added food, small-scale farming and food production are all there in abundance. These businesses rely on others being able to buy what they produce, and as shown above, this cannot be sustained by local trade alone. We must encourage rural businesses into the towns to enable them to put their produce in front of a larger audience. There are a number of initiatives in relation to this at the moment in South East Cornwall. A click and collect hub was set up in Liskeard on Saturday, with rural producers selling their wares to customers collecting them from a central hub. They did this with virtually no support, and long term they need a shop front to facilitate this over the long months ahead. This is about creating a connection between rural and urban, which is vital for food security and prosperity generally, but it has to be bottom up. It has to respond to what the rural businesses want and not what we as the funders or the council or anyone else think that they want. In doing this, we will encourage sustainable business growth, which we then have to support and nurture. In terms of population growth and dispersion, I'm absolutely not an expert on this at all, but I would like to give my own view. There's a surprise. Huge numbers of people living in cities have looked on in envy at Cornwall's historically low case numbers and the sheer amount of space and opportunity we had to be outdoors, and people are relocating to us in record numbers. Agents are reporting many unseen sales, with properties being snapped up without people even visiting. We have to manage this, as there are a disproportionate number of older, economically inactive people moving here. They have no community ties, and a greater number of second homes, both of which contribute little to our rural and coastal communities. So turning to young people, how do we retain younger people? I want to look at this in a different way. I worked with a group during my time in Europe from Finland who faced this issue. Instead of trying to hold on to the young people and not let them move away, they decided that this was a tide that they could not go against, and instead they should embrace it. So they positively encouraged young people to leave rural areas, move into the cities to gain formal qualifications, training and experience. They kept in touch with them directly throughout that time, and then they had a scheme that paid additional support in the form of grants and loans to those people who in their 30s moved back home with their families. It's a long-term strategy, but it worked, constantly reminding younger people what a great place the rural areas were to raise a family in and to start a business. This in turn, in Finland, stimulated secondary and tertiary economic spend in the area. It brought redundant buildings back to life, and it embraced new industries. The council could set criteria to encourage a similar scheme in Cornwall. My main concern, though, is about the lack of a clear strategy of business support going forward. Many of the EU programmes on which small businesses have relied upon come to an end in 2022. The demand is such in Cornwall for these final programmes, despite COVID, that looking at the pipeline of projects, it's likely that these funds will be committed before this deadline of 2022. Other support appears haphazard, with short lead-in times and no clear understanding of what the actual point of the funding really is. Many of the new schemes do not have the promised rural proofing built into them, which as a result means that our coastal towns are too small, or our rural areas are too rural, or not rural enough, our population is too dispersed or too concentrated. When these new funds are announced, my initial optimism gives way, unfortunately, to despair. Again, only those areas in Cornwall where there is capacity are able to pull together suitable bids within the short time scale, which goes back to the first point I made. The disproportionate effect of lack of investment and lack of human capacity in areas in Cornwall. We need an established long-term 10-year programme of funding and support to give confidence, which disproportionately supports specific areas. The Shared Prosperity Fund has been promised for well over 2 years, and to date the information about this is scant, and there doesn't really appear to be any appetite to bring it forward. If the SPF paper was published today by the government, fully formed, with figures for grants, a mechanism for distribution, criteria, etc., it would be a full 2 years before the first applications could be appraised. So that's the end of 2022-2023. And added to this is the lack of clarity from the RPA on the SFP and support for fisheries. This is hardly the right climate to encourage nervous business owners to invest in their businesses. We need to be clear that Cornwall needs external financial support. This is because of the unique challenges which being in business in Cornwall brings, with many businesses being asset rich and cash poor. We already have a healthy pipeline of businesses and community organisations looking for project support. I would not advocate support at 100%, but I do feel that loans to businesses to expand miss the point, that we are already at a disadvantage and that grants level up the playing field with better connected parts of the UK. In summary, the current support available is running out, and this shortfall and gap between one funding stream and another will have a catastrophic effect on business development in Cornwall. We need to lobby now with hard evidence, facts and figures, as well as informed stories for a new funding scheme for Cornwall, which will meet the pent-up demand and no doubt we'll see at the end of the COVID crisis. Whatever funding is available in whatever form, I'd urge the Council to ensure that a significant proportion of it follows the bottom-up principle. This works in Cornwall. You only have to look at the annual business awards here to see that the overwhelming majority of entrants and winners at some point in their business life receive bottom-up financial support. Local people, many as volunteers bedded into the local communities, have a much better idea of what will make a difference to them. They've been getting it right for years, and the only reason that this has not been as transformative as it could have been is because the process did not have sufficient trust in needed to allocate more funding. I say to everyone, look at what we've done with 5% of the funding, imagine what we could do with 50%. My time as a leg representative for the South West taught me the bottom-up approach is agile, it's most able to respond to changes and challenges, least bureaucratic and but in other industries. So if we know the bottom-up works, then why not be bold and ensure that in future funding streams are dealt with more in this way? We have to celebrate and support our tourism industry and recognise it's important to us rather than seeing it as an annoyance. I want to strongly advocate to the Council not to introduce a tourism tax, and this is my opportunity to do it, so I will. A tourism tax looks superficially attractive, but without a proper database of who has a tourism business, only those working above board will pay it. It's a blunt instrument. Instead, I urge the Council to introduce the first pilot tourism licence. We'd require all businesses who have more than one overnight paying guest per year to register the local authority for a fee and demonstrate they're safe and legal by submitting various documents and through randomised 10% inspections. This gives us information on scale and ensures we remove those that do not offer a safe experience to guests. All businesses would then pay their dues, refuse disposal being a key one. I'd go even further than this. I would like to see Cornwall Council lobby for the end of the small business rates exemption. Significant numbers of tourism accommodation businesses pay neither business rates nor council tax. Everyone should contribute to share the burden. And by doing the above, you'll collect the data on where tourism businesses are and be able to implement some of the levelling up policies I described previously. The cost of the licence would fund the additional staff to do this. This will stimulate the rural economy by assuring that only those businesses that comply will be registered and able to let to guests. And going forward, the council could be really bold and set limits on the numbers of registrations available for certain areas, as some councils already do with taxi licences. Turning then to the future, what methods are there for stimulating the economy in Cornwall? Setting aside central funding and lobbying for it to be appropriate to the needs, there are some things which you could do for rural and coastal areas. Number one, Cornwall can make a positive decision to support and work with bids for funding from areas where the funding has been the lowest in the past. You have the data to do this, you just need the courage. You will also need to spend money on building capacity, setting up business groups, funding their startups and first few years. The Council needs to take positive steps using the planning system to positively support large-scale infrastructure projects in those areas where there's traditionally been none. The Council needs to take the lead in spreading the load. Every time a new initiative is announced, a skills hub, a work hub, a food hub, I know without even looking that it won't be allocated to my area of Cornwall. Why is this? We need to ensure that we do not waste money. How much has been spent on training and support, and still our average attainment level is NVQ level 3. Grandiose projects staffed by people from up country promise the earth in terms of outputs, deliver very little, only to leave the area and leave no legacy behind. We must ensure that we spend money in Cornwall on projects for Cornwall. We do not need outside consultants and trainers. We have them here. We have to inculcate a spirit of trust in our communities, the very cornerstone of the bottom-up approach. Cornwall has a history of volunteers, people with a multitude of skills that they want to use to help to make a difference in their communities. I constantly feel that my volunteer colleagues are undervalued. I've been involved in many funding and volunteer bodies in the past 15 years, including the successful delivery of EU funds totaling millions. Not once have I received a letter of thanks from the council that I could share with my group. Why is this? Business support is crucial to the success of business in Cornwall, particularly new startups. People need help with business plans, cash flow, funding. By giving businesses a firm footing right at the very beginning of the business journey, they are more likely to succeed and more likely to be able to grow. They need one-to-one hand-holding over an extended period of time, not a quick and dirty computer course on AdWords delivered by Dave from Shropshire, which ticks the box but actually achieves very little. We do not need to sort this out of county. We have a huge resource of homegrown talent, and I will be bold on this and say no further projects using external bodies for the next 5 years. Cornwall Council needs to recognise Plymouth in my part of Cornwall. It's a huge economic driver. Many people work there, with children going to school from there too. And finally, the council must support the Cornwall Development Company. They have in their midst a group of talented individuals who are exemplars across the country and Europe at managing, allocating and controlling funding schemes, and we cannot lose local expertise. Thank you. Sorry, it was a rattle.
Kim, thank you. That well done. That must have taken you some time to prepare that. So thank you. There's an awful lot of thoughts in there, isn't there? I mean, I think for me, sometimes when you look at the inward investment that historically Cornwall has had, you can see some of it has been really successful and you think, well, that's wonderful. It has worked. Brilliant. And then other things you think, oh, well, actually, exactly as you said, you've had an outside body come into Cornwall, run a programme for some time and then departed. And actually, did it really make a difference? It might have done to some of the people that involved themselves, but it probably didn't leave, I think, what you described as legacy. So I think having that strategy for ongoing business support and what I would deem as trying to create fertile ground for businesses to be able to start and prosper and go somewhere. And that fertile ground requires support from the very start all the way through, and to make sure those businesses are supported and can access help, advice, finance, all of the things that we understand that businesses need is so important to us. Right, okay, let's go to Jane Pascoe first, please.
Hello. He always asks me first. Hello, Kim. It's lovely to see you. Such a long time now. Oh, so much of that I agree with you. You know I do. And this business, if I can start off with, there are lots of holidaymakers going to the wrong areas. It's not spread out. Now, I have a banter every time I meet Malcolm Bell from Visit Cornwall, to say that South East Cornwall is always left out of the promotions that go out. He always says, oh, it's about the advertisers. And I sort of say, well, you're too expensive then for the South East Cornwall ones. Can they do it as a group? But not only through Visit Cornwall, but through so much I see going out. It's all about the west side of Cornwall. We have our own natural beauty in South East Cornwall. We have the best food and farming producers in the land, and we have towns that would make wonderful platforms to showcase those produce. But how can we level up that marketing then? Because I know it's expensive to advertise with the Visit Cornwall. I've asked him if you could do it as a group. He hasn't come back to me. Do you think that would help us, level out the whole areas of Cornwall, that they're not all piling into Newquay or St Ives or Penzance, as we hear so much about? That was one thing. The last speaker, talking about second homeowners, came up with I thought a reasonable idea, was that, not at the moment because of COVID, they'd invited second homeowners to a sort of a lunch, a discussion about how could they help the community that they are living in because they do come down and they do spend money, and we haven't covered ourselves in glory with sort of sending out remarks about them, because they do help the economy. I just wondered what you thought about that, but we also know they take up houses that could be homes for locals. So I just wondered if you felt maybe we should meet with them and try and come up with some plans that they can actually contribute more to the community that they're coming into so often now. And that's basically, oh yes, absolutely agree about the consultants from outside bodies, from outside areas. They're doing the cattle market scheme in Liskeard. I tremble when I hear the figures, the consultants. We've got perfectly good architects and consultants in South East Cornwall, in Cornwall. Why are we having to have them from London who claim they're really in touch with the community and getting down with them, and actually they're only getting a very small section of that community that want to be contacted? So I think I've always felt that was wrong, and we waste so much money that way. Okay, I think that's probably, you said so much and I agree with it all. I was having a jot.
Thanks, Jade. I'll try and take those three in order if I can. So the first is about the Visit Cornwall point that you made, and I actually think it starts a long way before then. I think it's about the infrastructure, and I think it's we just have a tendency in Cornwall to put things in the same places. We don't look to the other areas, and as I say, have a look at where all the growth and skills and food hubs are. They're all west of Bodmin. There is very little to the north of the line at Bodmin. And I've been saying this for 15 years, and I'm now almost fed up with saying it, really, because there's been no difference made. And the only way to level that up is for the council to stop putting things in the same places, to stop putting Hall for Cornwall where it does, to stop putting the Stadium for Cornwall where it does, to look at moving those things, those investments, those big infrastructure things to elsewhere within the Duchy, and to actually look at our areas. And I think that it's a bit like, you know, if you put it there, people will come. And if the council took the lead and said, actually, we're going to start discriminating, we're going to discriminate against more things in the same place and in favour of more things in new places, then you would start to stimulate activity. But it has to start the ground up. It's bottom up again, isn't it? It starts with the infrastructure. So yes, we could tinker around the edges and ask Visit Cornwall to make it a bit cheaper for membership, etc., etc. But alternatively, we could support in a big way the cycle trail from Loo to Liskeard. We could really support that, not just financially, but with the planning process, with the help and support. We could do those things, and there are people out there that want to do them. Secondly, second homeowners, by contributing, paying business rates or council tax. How is that allowed to happen? How is it that somebody's accessing services, or they have visitors accessing services like flushing the toilet and running the tap, and they're not paying anything? How is that fair? And I think if we did that, there are an awful lot of second homeowners or people with one holiday cottage who would actually really welcome that. They would actually welcome the opportunity to pay. And I think that's a trick we've absolutely missed, but we need to be bold about that. And secondly, thirdly, you were talking about the external consultants. Ban them. Just, you know, as a council, make a policy that when a large infrastructure project has been put in place, the first port of call is to those people locally that provide those services, even if they're slightly more expensive. Because the London consultants do not reach out to people. No one, I live and work in the Liskeard area, no one's spoken to me from the consultants about the cattle market. So they're not reaching the people they need to. So I think what we need to do is, I'd like to see the council be bold. It won't get everything right. It will make mistakes and it will upset people, but I would really like to see some boldness, something different, and to come out of our comfort zone. Thank you.
No, thank you.
Okay, before I come to Mike, obviously, Kim, you had that statement. Would it be possible, is it in a format that you could share with us?
Absolutely, yeah, I can, there it is. I can email it to you.
Perfect, thank you very much. That's very kind of you. And before again come to Mike, can I bring David in, because David's indicated he'd like to have a word?
Yes, very much, Councillor Boy, David Rodder, Economic Growth Manager. Hi, Kim. Good to see you. Just to let on the procurement front, just being the technical bureaucrat, procurement law doesn't allow us to do that, unfortunately. Whether it's EU procurement law or linked to funding, or even UK-based procurement law. However, just so members are aware, the CAS, is that Community Overview and Scrutiny Committee, I think, is currently undertaking an inquiry into the purchasing processes deployed by Cornwall Council. It closes today. Economic Growth Service has put a response into that, which picks up that very point about how can we within the rules and within legal activity, put more of that funding into the local economy from a circular economy point of view. Often the way we procure at the moment, lots of local businesses aren't on the platforms that we have to use for all sorts of reasons, personal reasons sometimes, or so we have put I'll summarize with, we have put quite a strong response into that panel, that other inquiry, to try and drive that, and citing that Preston is often cited as one of the local authorities that has done this absolutely within the rules. And I think from memory, they've gone from spending 28 million in their local economy to something like 70 or 90 million in their local economy out of their budget. So that's quite a significant change purely through a different approach. So we're well aware of the point, Kim, and yeah, we're trying to do what we can.
Thank you, David. I accept that there are rules because I've been involved in European funding and know about the rules. But it was interesting to go to the meetings in Brussels with other countries and find how they managed to circumvent them quite successfully. But also, I think if the rule is there, there's no reason why we can't challenge it and show why we're challenging it and put a good case forward. Because we are ideally placed. We don't make enough of the fact of our geography, the positive parts of our geography, which is that we are ideal test beds for all sorts of things. It's easy to go to the government, and that's the tourism licensing. We are an ideal test bed for that. We can go to the government. The law exists, you can bring it in, but we can go to the government and say, yes, we'll test that. We'll be a pilot area. We really can do that because of the way we are, our geography. So why not make that a positive rather than a negative, and actually make that happen? And the same for this with the rules of spending money. If people aren't seeing those platforms, then we've got to work out how we get them to see those platforms, because we have all the skills here. We have huge numbers of skilled people, and yet we don't use them as much as we could.
No, just to give you no, you're absolutely right. I'll copy members into the response that we are submitting. But an example of one local business I know that absolutely has the skills to deliver what we require, but the personal indemnity insurance level that they have to have in order to contract for Cornwall Council, I think, is 5 million and above. But for their small business, the insurance premiums would be too high. So they fail at that first kind of gateway criteria. So that is something we can look at, and whether that is a blanket thing that has to be there for 5 million, something like that on a big infrastructure project or a road improvement or something is probably worthwhile. But that level of public indemnity on a consultation exercise on this guard cattle market, for example, is probably excessive. Because the risks are quite low. So we are making those points, and thank you again for raising them. So thank you, Chair.
Yeah, thanks, David. Good points. Just a question back to you, David, before I come to Mike. I understand the principle of framework sourcing agreements or supplier agreements that I believe Cornwall Council has with a number of people providing effectively construction services. I know for sure. Do we have a similar thing for intellectual services?
Yes, we do. So the framework is you go out and you procure a pool of consultants that then you can, or building firms or whatever, that you can pull from then without because they've been pre-procured, for want of a better term. So yes, that does exist for consultants. That's probably the way the consultants that are working on Liskeard Cash Market were brought in, because they went through that process. However, it is possible to go outside that framework. That is what economic growth has decided to do for, and given the discussions you've had today, this is going to raise some eyebrows about a project in Penzance. So there's the creative, I forget the exact name for it, but the creative hub cluster that's going in at the top of Market Dew Street. Rather than go to the framework to existing contractors, that is out for open tender, I believe. So local building firms can bid in to deliver that should they wish to. So that was a conscious decision that economic growth made to try and give local businesses an opportunity. We've also considered what we can do within current rules to see whether we can put within the tender documentation itself some sort of scoring criteria about the amount of local suppliers that those builders might use. So, you know, the building firm is one thing, but where are they buying their cement, where are they buying their wood, and all that kind of activity. So we are trying to do what we can within the current circumstances. There's always scope for more, I recognise that. And as I say, the Preston model, if you've ever got some time to have a look at it, what they've done is quite impressive, or very impressive, not quite impressive.
Okay, thanks, David. And I'm just thinking about some of the stuff that I'm listening to and trying to draw a conclusion. I think somewhere between what Councillor Dick Cole was saying earlier and what you're saying now, Kim, is that there seems to be a little bit of a feeling that perhaps rural and the rural areas are at a disadvantage when it comes to attracting funding and interest in more significant projects. This thought had actually occurred to me because one of the things I did mention very earlier briefly on was that I wondered why my patch up in Bude had missed out on internal investment and funding for projects for so many years, when it appeared that other towns were getting it all the time. And I was, well, why does that happen? And I think one of the reasons is we just haven't had, and if we'd had successes, 5, 7, 10 years ago, we probably would have built on those successes and built on our intellectual skills locally, a bank of people who are prepared to put themselves up and bid for projects and bid for money. We just never have had that. And I think that's something which I'm trying to develop here. But going back to what Dick was saying, I think there's an issue here of actually having to make a conscious decision, and listening to what you're saying, of saying, look, the areas that have actually missed out on this investment do need to be properly prioritised going forwards. And even if the cost is deprioritising some of the more skilled or more urbanised already areas that have had that funding, well, then I think that might just be something we have to accept.
I quite agree. I think what you have to do is you have to go, and talking about your example in Bude, I think you have to take a step back. And I think what you have to do is look at the very beginning of this. The places which can bid for funding are the places where they've already got groups on the ground, well-constituted community groups, business groups, meetings, those sorts of things. Those areas where they've got those groups, it's those groups who then have the ideas for the projects. They not only have the ideas for the projects, but they have the people to take those projects forward. They have people to fill the application forms in, which are laborious. They have the infrastructure there to provide to the projects. And so all of those things go on. And I can understand how it happens, because you're looking at the places where you think have the most chance of success with a scoring card, and you score it on the basis of people involvement, that sort of thing. And because those places have all of that, they score highly, so they just keep getting more and more. But you have the data there. Cornwall Council has the data on a map to show how much money has gone into each area of Cornwall over the past 20, 30 years. You will be shocked. I guarantee you'll be absolutely shocked when you see that map with all those figures plugged in of how much different areas have had over the past 20 years, not just from European funding, but from council support and business investments and those sorts of things. You'll be really shocked at how those areas are missing out. And the more we put the growth hub down west, the skills hub down west, the food hub, the more of those hubs you keep putting down there, the more you're building that inequality. And that's one of the reasons why so many people in South East Cornwall look into Plymouth. because Cornwall doesn't actually want them, doesn't want to support them. So if you want to bring that back in, if you want to inculcate that kind of spirit, it starts at the very, very bottom. It starts at a village hall with a community group of 20 people. That's where it starts. Getting that, building that, working with it. And it's not a short fix. There isn't a short answer to this. This is a 10 to 15 year programme, but the 10 to 15 years starts when you make the start. So if you start now, that's 10 to 15 years. If you start in 5 years' time, it's 20 years.
Okay, lovely. So Mike McLenning, Councillor Mike McLenning, would you like to come forward and have a chat with Kim?
Hi, Mike.
Hello, Kim. Do you remember me? I hope you do.
I do.
And it's when I first met you and David on those meetings, which, God, I couldn't follow them, and I'm still finding it hard from what you just said because you're so knowledgeable. So I do need your notes. I just touched what you last said about village halls. I was asked to start ours in Coombe about 10 years ago, and the one thing I learned about coming down to Cornwall to live permanently, no second home. I live here, work in the area for the councils. You don't try and change it; you work with them. But you have to bring a little bit of change, and we've got a good hall that's very popular, and if it wasn't for COVID, we'd still be in use. So I take your points on that. You are so knowledgeable. I'm going to make your head grow even bigger here, but I think, well, you're modest with it, but the visitors situation, we brought that up already with as Jane said, with the tourist manager. I forgot his name, Mr. Bell, isn't it? I can't remember his name. Yeah, it just got out of my mind. I didn't get impressed actually listening, because we did say about other areas rather than just the obvious ones, because if you live in London you think, oh, I'll go down to Padstow, I'll go down to Newquay and so on. You don't think anywhere else, so obviously it's not being marketed at all, as Jane's been saying, so it's neglected, totally neglected. So that's an opportunity. The ground up, I totally agree with you. What worries me, I didn't see part 2 of the Cornish programme last night because I record it, but the first one I thoroughly enjoyed. I thought there were some really good points in there. But if we hadn't had COVID, I don't think we were having the meetings that we're having, and that's what worries me. We're having this because we've discussed it in our committee, so it was planned. But other meetings, we live in meetings on some of the things coming up. They should have been thinking about before. Now, if I take that first one, when it was about Camborne being like a ghost town, all the industry going, well, I put this into the context of what you're saying. They know a lot of this, but they haven't reacted to it. They haven't done anything. They just let it be as it is. And now they're sort of saying, oh, we've got problems, we're not running the money and so on. And I don't think they've reacted. I think Cornwall has been poorly run, in my opinion. Now I look at it from a distance as a private sector person, to try and help some of the points you're saying. So I totally agree with that. And with the external consultants, well, it's obvious we had one from the health situation. I had to ask a question, I think, the other week in a meeting. What happened to it? Oh, they did a good job. You know, I spoke to one of the consultants as they pitched for the job, and he said, oh, we're not charging a fee if we get it. We save the council money. But I never knew if they did work until I was told that, well, they did. So I would love to explore your notes more, because you always were quite fast getting through things. Sorry. And perhaps come back and go through it and ask you some more questions. But the basic concept, I agree with you because I respect your knowledge and I can't really question it. So thank you.
Thank you, Mike. I didn't submit my notes. I'm sorry. I apologise for that. I will do, and I'm always happy to come back at any point and take any questions, even in writing or whatever, to explore further. I do think this is an opportunity for Cornwall to be bold. I wouldn't make any comment on how it's been run in the past or whatever, because I very strenuously keep out of politics of all sorts, big P, little p, or any other P that you might like to think of. So I think it's just important that we look at how we can be bold and do things differently. Because if we don't do things differently, then if you keep doing the same things, you always get the same results. And I do think that part of the problem is about showcasing, moving visitors from those areas like Padstow, Newquay, where everyone thinks of and where really get overloaded, down onto, I mean, like the Rame. I went out into the Rame in August. There was nobody. There was nobody. There were no tourists there. and yet I wouldn't have wanted to go to Newquay. So there are areas in South and East Cornwall which have capacity, and you would make businesses thrive if you move tourists there, but you have to do it positively. You have to, and you also have to discriminate, unfortunately, against those areas that have had all the funding in the past, which I'm sure they won't like, and I'm sure there'd be some kickback about. But if you really want to make a difference, that's what I really think you have to do.
Well, Kim, it's too easy to do the old 80-20 scenario when you're looking at money, and it's so easy. You know, my mum could have done that job, and she wasn't at all academic. You know, simple. Truro, St Austell, Penzance, you would name it, but the rest of them are forgotten. Although my first kiddie holiday was a farm in Bude when I was a boy. So, all right, thanks for that, Kim, and I welcome your input. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for those questions and observations. But it's such a difficult thing when you start thinking about, you know, particularly that Simon Reeve programme where he goes into Cambourne and you see the desperation on the minds of some of the young people there who probably would quite like to have decent jobs and they're just not there. You think, well, what can have gone so badly wrong? And I think the trouble is there has been investment, Mike. It hasn't been entirely left out, but the investment probably hasn't worked really as well as it should have done. And what it hasn't done is it hasn't created the jobs and the economy that perhaps it would have been desired or perhaps planned at the outset. I'm sure Kim has, you know, obviously she explained on her CV at the opening, she's been involved in her local action group, well, more than involved, chairman of a local action group, and you'll have seen, Kim, that people come forward with great ideas to stimulate economy and business, and actually it's more difficult than meets the eye, and to actually have that overall strategy is a very difficult thing to accept. In your opening statements, Kim, you talked about a strategy for business support, and I think a strategy for Cornwall to actually understand where the high spots have been and where the low spots currently are, and probably a much longer term strategy, like you said, a 10 to 20 year strategy would be probably a very good thing. I just wondered if you want to expand on that a little bit.
So I think going back from that, investment is not the same as building capacity, and I think we don't take the issue of building capacity seriously enough. I think when you start to build capacity, what you do is you build something in longer term. So when you set up these business groups, these support groups, all of these things, when you set those up and you work with those and you start to build them, you build up local capacity, local intelligence. And I thank Mike for the very kind words he said about me, but you know, I'm just an ordinary Joe actually. I used to work in local government. I came down here, ran a business, and it's just because over a period of 15 years, people at the Cornwall Development Company and elsewhere put time and effort into explaining things to me, sending me documents, involving me, getting me, you know, building my personal capacity, that I'm able to sit here and do this today. And I'm not alone. There are lots of people like that. But when you talk about, you know, how we target areas, how we do that, it really does start right at the very base. It starts with the planning policy. It starts with the funding policies. That's how you build it. I think that was the question you asked, you know, about. But we have to start with capacity building, and we have to look at bottom up. The bottom up approach works. Top down, bringing in consultants from somewhere else, it really works. We know it works, and yet it always gets a tiny weeny bit of funding. And when you're talking about the amount of money that's gone into somewhere like you know, Cambourne, Poole, Redruth, where we know historically there are issues, who made those decisions? Whose decision was it to spend the money on those things? Was it the 16, 17 and 18-year-olds in the street? Or was it some consultant coming in from London who said, I think that's what you need? I bet I know what it was. And it's about speaking to people and trusting them. And sometimes they'll come up with absolutely bonkers ideas. And you'll sit and think, but you've got to trust. And you will fail, but you will also succeed.
Yeah, thanks, guys. I think sometimes bonkers ideas need to be listened to a bit more. And I wonder if the 16 to 17-year-olds, having planned the future capacity of Cambourne, might have been better placed to actually understand and deliver that than perhaps the London consultants. Never mind, that's just a thought. David Rodder has indicated. David, would you want to come forward?
Yeah, thank you, Chair. It was just to pick up on Kim's capacity building bit. She's mentioned the bottom-up approach, the leader, community-led local development, all that type of activity. One of the things that, and Kim will know that I've banged on about this a number of times, is forgotten about the whole discussion around funding through those means, is the approach. There are 7 principles of the leader approach, one of which is capacity building the local community to understand the issues around and capacity build the individual. It's quite interesting to me because I started out my career in economic development in a leader group, and when you see the people that were involved in the local action groups, where they were when they started and where they are 3 years later, 5 years later, 10, 20 years later, it is quite amazing. And it's not to say that you need to be on a leader group to build your own capacity, but it is an unwritten kind of benefit, because people focus on the issue of giving a grant and forget there's all these wider benefits that come from the activity, that once the grant disappears, you've left that capacity behind. So the 7 principles of the leader approach, as it was, and just a very short history lesson for members. Leader was a funding program that was started in the mid-90s, I think it was. And the reason it was started was a European commissioner at the time, responsible for rural development, recognised that the mainstream European funds, so ERDF, ESF, and the Agricultural Fund, were missing rural areas. So he pioneered through the Commission a top slicing of all the European funds to create something called LEADER. And LEADER bottom-up delivery, there were the first round. West Cornwall, I think, was the first one in the first round, and then it was joined by China Clay and one in North Cornwall as well, and it's grown on from there. But the fundamental principles that underpin it have kind of been forgotten, and there's a lot of benefit in there about that underpins that kind of bottom-up approach.
I quite agree.
Okay, so David, thanks for that. So Kim, let's go back to these recommendations, because I think you actually did do them for us, but
I did.
you went through at such pace. I'm not sure we did that great. So can we just revisit those, if that's okay?
Yeah.
And
I'll find them. I've got them somewhere. Yeah, here they are. So I sort of made broadly recommendations. So the first was positive support and work with bids for funding from areas where funding has been the lowest in the past. Using the data that you already have, but also using some courage to do that. Using some money and some time, and time is more important than money, to start building the capacity that you need in those areas so that they can take that forward. And also the council taking positive steps to use the planning system to support the large scale infrastructure projects and hubs in particular in those areas where there's traditionally been none. So that's one. And saying that the council needs to take the lead in spreading that load, so that every time a new initiative is announced, it doesn't go to the same old area. The second was that not wasting money on things that we don't need to spend on. So we need to target any support or any money that we spend and spend it locally. And we can do that as David has outlined. Looking at inculcating the spirit of trust in our communities and actually starting to value our volunteers a bit more. And I'm not asking for people to write me a thank you letter. I'm talking about all those hundreds of people that I've worked with over the years who volunteer in large and small ways. And business startups. So business support. The reason a lot of projects don't get off the ground is because the people have got brilliant business ideas. They're very good crafters. They make great gin or jewellery or cheese. But what they don't do is use the computer or fill forms in. And they need someone to sit with them one-to-one. And I do some of that informally, as away from all the other things I do. I'll often see a business advertising that's struggling and speak to them as on a one-to-one and do some support with them just to help them to target in the right ways. Even simple things like spell check before you send out a letter, to make sure that you get your message across and it looks professional. And finally, saying about supporting Cornwall Development Company, you need these people. They are your economic arm, and they haven't paid me to say this. I'll be honest with you there, but they are absolutely brilliant. And you've got those skills there. They also have all the data, and some of the data is in writing, but some of the data is in people's heads. And I think it's really important that you use that more as a driver forward. I think there's a lot that we could do to make a difference, but it's just about moving to that point.
Okay, lovely. Kim, thank you very much. I think we've got all that down. I think we've had a really valuable session with you. I think it's been a million miles an hour, but I hope we've all kept up. I think we have. We really appreciate.
And she knows that's unfortunately I have so much to say that I can't often get it all out in one go. So I do apologise.
Right.
No. It was lovely.
Not at all. And if you said that not once in all your time had you been thanked as a volunteer in your lag, I'm not sure if I quite got that right, but let me be the first from this group to say thank you very much indeed for your time. And I
will write to the lag and make sure that they know that at the next lag meeting that we were thanked. Thank you.
Right.
Thank you.
Kim, thank you. So Matthew, I see you in the room, but I'm just about to call a 10-minute break. So I do apologise.
10-minute break suits me. I'll make some coffee.
Right. Okay. So if
stay on, shall I?
Just before 12 o'clock, is that okay?
Yeah, sure. Shall I stay on? Just leave the link running.
Yeah, just leave it there. Maybe put your microphone on mute.
Yeah.
So we don't hear you feeding the dog or whatever you're going to do. Yeah. All right, and we're back. We'll all be back just before 12 o'clock.
All right. Great. Thanks.
Yeah.
expert witnesses.
No, you're black back.
Right, okay, it's not quite 12 o'clock, so we can be informal just for a few moments, if that's all right. Are we all back? Jane? Mike?
I'm here, sorry.
Well
Yes,
done.
I'm back, Chair.
Right, lovely. Interesting morning so far, isn't it, everyone? I think they always have been, haven't they? Okay.
I thought it was very good. Very good.
Yeah. So if we're all here, which I believe we are, Lynn, I'm interested if any of the other panel members given apologies today.
Councillor McKenna has.
Right. Okay. Right. Lovely. Thank you. So Matthew, I know I'm a couple of minutes before 12, but if you're in the room, we'll crack on. I can see your ceiling at the minute.
Lynn,
Wonderful.
loads of notes to
Beams
take.
you have too.
Oh.
Say again, Mike.
Lynn must have loads of notes to keep writing down.
Can we have a copy of Kim's statements? There's some
Yes.
really interesting bits for South East Cornwall that I found very useful comments.
Yes,
That was my first introduction to.
I couldn't manage it, and even listening back to it, it was very quick, wasn't it?
Yeah, but it covered a lot of ground. It was really good.
Yeah, I think she was slightly more than cantering, wasn't she? So yeah, right. But Matthew, what wonderful whitewash beams you have in the background.
So, sorry? Oh, yes. They're not,
Right,
they're not as old as they look, actually.
Right, okay. Right, so Matthew, for your benefit, thank you very much indeed for joining us. We really do genuinely appreciate it. This is an inquiry panel of Cornwall Council looking at and examining the economic vitality of rural and coastal areas in Cornwall. And just to give you a tiny bit of background, we've gone through several witnesses so far. I think we've got one more day of witnesses left, and basically they've all been asked very simple. They've had a very similar pack of information given to them. I think it's probably exactly the same, to be honest, just to explore the levelling up, if you like, of opportunity for rural and coastal economies compared to town and urban areas, and also just to look at and examine the relationship of villages and rural settlements to the local towns that service them. So hopefully you've got that on board and you understand that.
Yeah.
The process that we've been doing, you probably just saw the tail end of the last one, 10 to 15 minutes. Don't feel you need to use it all, just to say whatever's on your mind and to give your take on where we are currently with rural and hinterland areas compared to towns. And then we'll just have an informal chat with you one by one through the panel, and that normally stimulates some quite interesting conversation. So thanks for being here. Really do appreciate it. The floor's yours.
Okay, so I won't assume that you know everything that I've been doing recently. So just very quickly run through two or three things. First of all, just at the end of being the MP, I was asked to do a review of rural housing and rural economy for the then government, and that led to something called Living Working Countryside, which was basically a planning policy review, and that created neighbourhood planning and fed into the national planning policy framework. And since then, most of what I do is a mixture of planning policy work with government and others, and then what you'd call planning implementation around sustainable communities, much of it, as you would imagine, directed towards rural. I do a bit of work on urban renewal, but rural, I would include the rural market towns in that, but it was, the original review was focused primarily on the more rural areas. And I've also then subsequently worked particularly on new community and sustainable development policies, creating the Garden Village programme nationally, and actually also on renewable technologies. That's probably less immediately relevant to what you're saying, but it's essentially that's the whole area in which I work. one thing that you may want to ask questions on, but I'm not going to talk about, but I also have, for a long time, was non-exec director at South West Water and did a lot of the work on creating both the last and the current investment programmes. So I now chair their Watershare Plus, which is essentially the customer-facing panel to hold them to account on delivery of that programme. So I do have that, which may be relevant to your inquiries as well. And then finally, I chaired the Roach neighbourhood plan, which delivered a neighbourhood plan in Roach. Kind of felt obliged, having been kind of part of creating the policy, but they twisted my arm nonetheless to do it. But it's quite interesting because it's one of very, very few neighbourhood plans anywhere in the country in poorer communities. So even within Cornwall, it tends to be what you'd call the wealthier coastal areas, particularly of neighbourhood plans, the wealthier towns. They're very hard things to deliver. They take way too long. There's an enormous amount involved in doing them. And just nationally, they've been very rare in poorer communities. But this was a transformative one. And assuming we do deliver the Northstall A30 link road, it will have achieved very substantial change, where we essentially backed that on the and in return would allow further delivery of housing in the village, which we weren't obliged to do given the amount of development to take place. So it was a classic example of a community opting to deliver transformative change for the community. In this case, essentially to get the lorries out of the village, but agreeing more housing in return for that. So broadly speaking. Anyway, I want to take you back in terms of your thinking to my thinking back in 2007-8 when I did that rural review, because I think most of it still applies. And I broke it down into 4 or 5 key headings, and I'm just going to run you through those. And then I'm happy to answer questions on whatever you like. The first proposition, which has become relatively established thinking now, but is easier said than done, and doesn't always inform people's thinking. So you tend to get people taking sides on bits of this. But when I came in, sustainability tended to be almost exclusively thought of in terms of the environment. And in terms of rural communities, it was almost exclusively thought of, you can't have any development because it's not sustainable. It'll be bad for the environment, it's bad for the beauty, so you can't have change. And you saw a lot of places that were essentially being wrapped in aspic and not allowed to change at all. And my argument was 2 things. One is that sustainability is not just about the environment. It's about social sustainability, economic sustainability, and environmental sustainability taken together. And that for any community, you need to have those 3 pieces put together. And we kind of understand that. So Roach isn't perhaps the best example, but if you think about a community like this, you don't want it to turn into a town. You're not allowing unlimited development to take place because you don't want it to sprawl out into the countryside. Obviously, all the more so if it's a coastal village or a particularly beautiful hamlet. But if you allow, if you simply freeze it, and particularly if it's in a pretty area, so Roach may not be the best example, the people who can afford to live there are the ones who outcompete everyone else, and they tend to be the wealthiest because they'll pay extra for the quality of place. And the wealthiest in this context is actually people with capital, whether they are within the county or often moving in from high value areas elsewhere, so they're selling property elsewhere, or they're people who've always been there and therefore are lucky enough to be already owning somewhere. And what that does is age the community, and it ages it quite rapidly. And that shuts the school, it shuts the shop. It means that the person working on the farm to look after the livestock is actually driving in from Camborne because they can't afford to live in the village and there's nowhere for them to rent. That is not sustainable. It's not economically sustainable. It's not socially sustainable because it's destroying the things that, if you like, make it a sustainable community. It makes it a place that the people who work there drive there because they can't afford to live there, and the people who live there don't work, broadly speaking. So to create sustainability, we need to think of it as environmental, social and economic together, and we need to allow change, because if you don't allow change, the thing will become more and more unsustainable in every sense. And you also need to make sure that the people who will work there and the people who have the kids can afford to live there, as well as the people who are retiring professionals can live there. And people who will work in the shop and the pub and the farm are clearly going to be nothing like the income of the accountant and the lawyer who's chosen to live in the converted farmhouse or whatever because it's a lovely place to live and commutes into Truro. But equally, you don't want the place to grow. So you don't want Portloe to be twice the size it is now in 20 years' time or 30 years' time, and then having to double again because all the houses have become expensive and sold off. So to manage that, you need to have a very long-term vision of place, which says we're going to keep Portloe as a pretty place, but that means we also need for it to be sustainable to have a shop and a pub and a school. And if we're going to have those things, we need to have a range of housing fit for everyone. And we can't keep selling them if they are affordable, because if you sell them as affordable, then you've got to build another lot 5 years later and another lot and eventually it becomes bodmin. So the policy doesn't work. So if you're going to preserve the rural communities as something special and say that villages will stay villages and coastal communities won't grow, you need to not think about what happens in the next 5 years. You need to think about what kind of place it is in 50 years and design policy around that. So that was really the first proposition, but it's a really important way of thinking about it, because it's the very nature of saying we don't want places to change much actually forces you to take a longer term vision of how that community can remain sustainable. Ironically, places that are changing and growing, you don't, in some ways, have to take as long-term a vision because they're adapting constantly anyway. The second bit was that I confronted on one of the local councils, just by chance, just at the time I was asked to do the review, somebody had had come to me complaining because they weren't being allowed to develop their business. They were actually an academic book retailer, distributor. They happened to live in one of the little clay villages in an old converted farmhouse. They worked from it originally, and they employed labour both from the village and from surrounding villages and from St Austell. And they used the old barn and the farmhouse, and they essentially built it from the kitchen table. They built it up, but they now employed a reasonable number of people, not a huge number, but a reasonable number. It was a little thriving business in the old farm complex. But they needed to grow. And they'd gone to the council asking to build some new buildings, essentially for warehousing the books. There were a couple more staff, but if they didn't do that, they needed to move. And the council had said, oh no, businesses should be operating in St Austell. We have a policy that says businesses should be in the employment centre because it's more sustainable, because that's where people live. We don't want people travelling into the villages. And they said, but actually our people already live here. Yes, some of them come from St Austell, but equally others live in the village. You'll only reverse the flow. And actually, we're the only life in the village in the daytime. We're the one place that's working, other than the farms. And my proposition was the idea that you can't have employment in the village because it's not quote unquote rural. People like the CPRE saying basket weaving's all right. A farm. A tomato plant is fine, actually, no matter how big it is and how inappropriate. A cattle shed's fine, however visually ugly it is. But you can't have this little business there is absolute nonsense. The issue should be not, is it a rural business, but is it of an appropriate scale and impact? And if there's not lots of lorries coming in and out, and if there's not lots of noise because it's a car scrapyard, and if it's not 100 people in an office centre that's is inappropriate to the village. Actually, in the modern world, with the internet, with the fact that it's not breaking cars these days, it's designing something. We should be encouraging small-scale rural enterprise within those communities. And the most obvious example is the person who, like me, is working from home, but might be an architect or a solicitor or an accountant or a designer or an IT programmer, if they want to employ 2 or 3 people, why wouldn't we let them build a larger room on the side of the house with its own access and a coffee point and a loo, which we don't usually allow, and yet we would allow them to build a room on the side of the house for a pool room, assuming it's not a listed building. What's the difference between those 2 things? Well, one of them is actually of no value to the village, and the other is not only maintaining rural employment, because he might employ a secretary, he might employ a young graduate within the community, but it will also improve the value. And what you get in Cornwall with all of these micro businesses, I think we do attract quite a lot of professionals in the county. Some of them returners, post-university years, some of them families looking for a better lifestyle, some of them homegrown professionals who've built up working within a business and then do their own. And they'll work from home, but they're self-limiting the business because they've got nowhere to employ several people. And if you're in a lovely village as an IT designer or whatever it is, and you might grow the business, and your only option to do that is to commute into Truro and hit the traffic jams, actually you'd think, well, I'm not going to bother doing that. I've got decent income, I'm not going to bother. But if you could actually grow it within the community, that village, it's going to be no downside to that, frankly. Actually, it'll be more sustainable. There'll be less movement, and you might be driving rural wages up by offering a modern alternative. And in the age of the internet, and of course, coronavirus has made that very evident, because all over the country, people have suddenly realised what working from home means and the pluses and minuses of it. And I think you're going to see it driving more people to look for homes in Cornwall. I think you're going to see more people thinking, actually, I don't want to go into the office. I want to run my own business. Cornwall is already full of micro businesses, but we know that they're very low income businesses. So enabling them to grow and enabling them to grow within rural communities. And that means thinking about, well, actually, are the old shops something we could convert to offices? Or a drop-in cafe where you can work from home around the corner, which is I do quite a lot. I find it very hard to work at home because there's too many distractions. So I'll go in a cafe and work at my laptop. So there are little, and that cafe, of course, then serves the community as well. And it's part of the vision of the Carclays Ecotown, is that it's a home working hub with every house with space to work, internet connections, and a cafe that serves the community, sort of work only one, but actually has got maybe a photocopier at the back. It maybe even have a meeting room. It's something that can be multifunctional to allow all that to happen. So again, a different idea of what preserving communities is about and how you address rural employment. The third chapter was about neighbourhood planning, and that was essentially saying let the village take its own decision about where that happens. Don't let the village decide that it's not going to have any housing. That's a national policy and a Cornwall policy. But where that housing is, don't be too prescriptive. The reason that Roach wanted a neighbourhood plan is that a planning officer had said that the glebe field in the middle of the village was the perfect place for development. Well, actually, of course, it was the place that fetes and fairs took place and everyone regarded as a nice open space in the community. What they actually chose was development around the edge. And that was their choice to allow communities to do that. They've often got quite a, so if you say to them, look, you need 20 homes, the sustainability community does that. But where you place them and how you design them is in your hands. But for neighbourhood planning, I think the biggest weakness is what I said earlier. You see it in the middle class areas and not the working and poorer communities. And the reason is that it takes an enormous amount of effort and skill. And if you've got a retired ex-planner or a retired barrister, they're very good at it. It's much harder in a community like the one I live in, where there's scarcely a professional to shake a stick at. Frankly, there's relatively few people here who've even been to university, and those who have struggled to make a living, so they haven't got the time. There's not many retired professionals like that here. It's just the nature of the community. But all neighbourhood plans struggle. I think nationally it needs to be simpler. But one of the things that Cornwall did for us well is support it, but I think more support for that, but also more clarity that it's about a long-term vision of a sustainable place, economically, socially, and environmentally, not just one of those, rather than it just being how you fend off planning. Those are the three main things. And I'll just very quickly mention one last, which is I came to the conclusion you can't think about how you deliver the sustainable rural community without acknowledging that the market towns are intrinsic to that. So my brief effectively didn't, fine not to include the cities in one way. I mean, they are growing, so it has an impact. But for a place like Cornwall, the market towns always have been the spider at the centre of the web. They're the service centre, they provide the facilities. People have always had to go into the market town for certain things and come out of the market town for certain things. So how the relationship with the market town works is really critical. How you get in and out of them, how you access services, how services are distributed out. It's very, very easy for an accountant in government to say, oh, you only need 3 job centres in Cornwall because there's only 500,000 people, ignoring the fact that if you're in Portreath, how do you get into the Truro job centre if you haven't got a job? If the library is only in town, are you actually going to use it? And then they'll say, it's not viable to have the full service. We can provide a better service in Truro. Well, the answer is if you live in Roach, you don't expect to have Tesco's in Roach, but you're very, very pleased there's a co-op. You don't have to have the same level of service. The irony of the ambulance targets for getting to people is they said, well, you've got to get to people within 10 minutes or whatever the figure was for 90% of the population. Well, you do that by only doing it in the market towns and ignoring the rural. So the rural is the 10% that doesn't get it within 10 minutes, at which point it doesn't matter if it doesn't get it for an hour. They tick the box on the service. What actually you want in Roach is you know that you're not going to get the ambulance necessarily in 10 minutes, but you would like to get it within 20 minutes. So you need to set policy that doesn't effectively say you don't count. Because we can meet our target by the 80% who are in the town. Does that make sense? I hope I'm explaining that right.
Yes, it does, Matthew. I mean, my sort of observation on that is that we seem to have been through a far too long a phase of being fixated on the centralisation of power and service, whereas actually power and service is much better to be delivered on a much more local scale. And I think somehow we've recognised this, but equally somehow we seem unable to actually flipping well do it, and that does frustrate me.
Well, I think a lot of it is this measure that says we want to get these high quality services, and they define the high quality, and they say we're 90% or 80 people, this is going to be a benchmark, but we know you can't get it to everyone. And as soon as you do that, you get a group that is left out. And in the context we're talking about, that's very likely to be the more remote rural communities. Whereas if you said we've got a minimum standard of that's deliverable to everyone, and that's what our target is, your mindset then becomes about, well, how do we get that to St. Just?
No, absolutely fascinating. I think, you know, in my mind, what you're saying is the scorecard, the benchmarks of success are effectively set that disfavour rural communities.
Yeah. So the benchmark of success should be, how do we get what we regard as the minimum acceptable service to everybody? And then we might, you know, some people may do better than that. You know, we'd all like the most fantastic home in the country, but the minimum is a home. Every child would like to be at the best possible school in the country. Well, we'd like every school to be the best school in the country, but the minimum is that they will get a decent school within range. So the mindset of there are basic fundamental services we will provide to all. I mean, internet is a pretty good example of that. we can get faster and faster and faster in the centres quite easily. And of course, you hit huge numbers of people like that. But actually, the question for somewhere like Cornwall is, how do you make sure that that quality of service is for all? My son's just been invited to do a coronavirus test, part of the national thing. You have to have internet access for that.
Okay, right, Jane, I'm going to give you pre-warning that I'm going to come to you after I've asked this question. I'm not going to break the habit of the morning. I'm going to come to you first. But before I come to you, Matthew, at the very beginning, you said something really fascinating to me. And you talked about the balance between three things: the social, economic and environmental sustainability of anything that you're enterprising in. And I just wondered, of those three different considerations, would you see those three as equal? Or are they going to vary from time to time? And how would you establish that balance?
Well, broadly speaking, I think the answer is probably equal, but I think I'd say something which I think is more interesting, if a little bit more intellectually taxing, which is that I don't think any one of them works without the other two. So, if I said to you, which do you think is more important? Breathing, eating or drinking? The answer is, well, you have to do all three. And there might be moments in time when, you definitely can't stop breathing, but actually if you stop eating, sooner or later you'll starve, and drinking somewhere in between the two. So, in a given moment, you might say, well, this is a priority, but actually you have to take all three. And I think one of the problems is historically with the rural, the really rural, the little pretty villages, a good example, yeah. So the prettiest villages have been told you can have nothing can change, because that's environmentally, and I'm taking that as a landscape as well as a carbon issue. It's unsustainable. But actually, if it just gentrifies and the shop closes and the school closes, that's socially not sustainable, but actually in the end it's not good for the environment, because people start to have to drive everywhere for everything they do. If there's no economic sustainability, then again the place effectively is dying on its feet, and that starts to have knock-on consequences for the environment. As I said, it's a genuine example. Was I met a guy who he was a farmer, and he said he'd moved from livestock to arable. And I asked him why, and he said, because I can't get a livestock herdsman. And I had one applicant who was from Camborne. He couldn't get in at 5 o'clock in the morning from Camborne, and we looked, and there was not a single place we could rent, because it was all in the holiday market. Now, in that case, they'd moved to arable, but in essence, they'd made the business unviable as it was. So I think you have to balance the three, but the most useful thing is what I said was take the 50-year vision. What do you want this place to look like in 50 years? And that's different from, do we build these two houses at the end of the road? No, because it will be horrible. Actually, you start to get much more agreement, because you can work back on, well, what will we need to do to have the school open? Well, the most bare minimum is you're going to have children. Pretty bloody obvious. So, how do you keep the shop open? Well, actually, as a bare minimum, you need someone to work in it.
No, love it. Matthew, quite right. Lovely observations and really well made. So, Councillor Jane Pascoe.
Thank you. May I call you Matthew? Hello,
Yeah.
Good morning. I'm the member for Liskeard West and Dobb Walls, so I'm quite predominantly there, right in the middle of the agricultural hinterland with villages. I was so pleased to hear you say that the market towns are interested to the rural hinterland, because there's one thing, my little drum that I bang so often, is that a small market town like Liskeard has 3 high street banks remaining, plus all the architects, professional services, architects, accountants and that sort of thing, because of what goes on in the hinterland. And those goods and services are all much needed by all those things that go on in the villages. We have a catchment area of, I think it's 33,000, more or less. So that's really important. And it's gradually being reduced because things are getting centralised. And I include in that market facilities for farmers, for their livestock and things are all being centralised or moved on. Too far away for them to leave their farms for the day, so therefore they're selling dead stock, dead on the internet, which actually is eroded quite a lot onto that town centre and the community. So that's one thing I wanted to ask you about. And then you were talking about sustainable villages. Well, you will, I know, well remember the famous traffic jams through Dog Walls until you then managed to get the bypass go through. Absolutely fantastic. Two sides of the village that could never cross the road to even chat suddenly have a village, a really lovely village with not a lot of traffic going through it. But then a bypass creates infill land, because between the two roads, all of a sudden extra land comes. Now it's a sustainable village as well. So we have a shop, post office, facilities, a pub, a church, and a bus route. So yep, ticks all those boxes. But poor little Dog Walls is now not the rural village we all knew. It's actually becoming an urban sprawl. And we've had 250 houses delivered in the last 5 years in Dog Walls, which is good. A lot of them affordable, but a lot of them have come on the back of rural exception sites, which is every corner of the village where there was a green field has become a rural exception site. But now what I've got is a village school that I can't get the village children into because it's jam-packed full. And so they're having to be transported elsewhere. So to me, in some of the policies, somewhere we need to address that, because this is going to happen to other villages. The other thing about Dog Walls, actually, and I'm sorry to get parochial, Chair, but it's something I can, when you mention villages, we actually have more employment opportunities in Dog Walls than I think there are in Liskeard. We have the big Puckator, Tyflex, quarry, garage, all sorts of opportunities, and Trago Mills, of course, within probably walking distance if necessary. So we've got the jobs, but what we haven't got, the infrastructure hasn't caught up with the schools. No chance of expanding that school because they've allowed a housing estate be built around it. So, it's interesting to hear what you were saying, and we're sort of in reverse rather. So I wondered what your view was on that.
If you took the Roach example, of course, there's a lot of comparables. Roach had a huge amount of housing delivered in it because it was seen as a China clay village, and that didn't matter. So we doubled in size over a little bit more than a decade, with some of the poorest quality estate building I've seen anywhere. Roach is famous for Roach Rock and the chapel on the top, which you used to be able to see from anywhere in the village. And in order to deliver that housing, they demolished both the medieval farmstead and built on the ridgeline, so you can no longer see it from much of the village. And the comment from the then planning officer was, we don't do heritage in the clay. So you can see, truly terrible development. On the other hand, we've got a thriving butcher, a co-op, actually quite a range of stuff. And were that housing not there, probably some of that would have already gone. So I think I come back to the point I made earlier about a 50-year vision of place. Because if you think about what you want the place to be, and if you're taking a view that you don't want Dog Walls to grow that much, but you also say, well, we've got this employment and we've got the school. This is the size school. Will we grow the school? That's been an issue in Roach because the estate was built next to the school. So those children on distance got priority. So the sons and daughters of the longer standing bits of the community have found that they can't get their children into the school and they're being taxied down to other schools. which of course was part of the reason they wanted no development. And yet what we've ended up doing is supporting 250 more homes to get the traffic out, but in a much, much more carefully planned and thought through way, where the community itself is deciding which sites and which sites not, and it's not led by a kind of planner tick, you know, this one's next to the school, therefore it goes through no matter what. But the most important bit is that it's not done in estate by estate arguments. And you see this around all of the market towns, where you get short term, we need to have a bit more housing, we haven't got our 5-year supply, this estate application's in, do we allow it or do we not? There's a campaign for it as if it's the last estate that's ever going to be built. It gets through because it has to, then on viability grounds, it's dumbed down because the land costs so much. And then that one's barely got through, and then you're on to the next estate. And all of my planning work is about saying that's the wrong way to do it. What you need to do is take a long-term view. And actually, my views were shaped on this by a conversation with town councillors from Liskeard, as it